The true story of the Babylonians does not begin with the dramatic raising of its monumental blue gates, nor does it start when its grand stone temples first dominated the horizon of Mesopotamia. Long before Babylon rose to absolute power, and long before its very name echoed across the ancient landscapes as a symbol of imperial majesty, the geography of southern Mesopotamia was already a fertile cradle of human civilization. To understand the genesis of Babylon, one must travel back through the deep mists of time, arriving at a fractured, wild world nestled between two great forces of nature, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. This unique landscape, a vast floodplain of rich alluvial soil, periodically carved by unpredictable waters, was the stage where humanity first learned to bend nature to its will, transitioning from scattered tribal existence into the world's earliest urban societies. As you listen tonight, let the centuries pass softly, and let the long, rhythmic story of the Babylonians carry your mind into a deep and peaceful rest. Before we step completely through the heavy gates of the ancient world, and as you make yourself entirely comfortable in the quiet of the evening, take a gentle moment to dim your lights, leave a like, and subscribe to our channel. If you connect with these deep historical journeys, please share your thoughts with me in the comments below, as hearing from you is always an absolute honor. Where are you listening from tonight, and what hour of the night is it for you right now? Seeing your footsteps gather here from all corners of the world to share in these memories always brings a deep, unspeakable joy to this archive. Now, let the outside world fade into total silence. Breathe deeply, and let our journey begin. In this ancient southern expanse, ancient cities such as Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu were already thriving as monumental centers of commerce, religion, and political authority at a time when Babylon itself was still nothing more than an obscure, unnamed village along the riverbanks. The original architects of this civilization were the Sumerians. By the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, the Sumerians had achieved a sequence of world-shattering technological milestones. They developed the earliest known system of writing, engineered massive irrigation networks to control the volatile seasonal river floods, and constructed the first ziggurats, colossal step pyramids of sun-dried mud brick that served as spiritual ladders connecting the human realm with the distant cosmos. Their language, an isolated tongue entirely unrelated to any other known human speech, dominated the cultural and administrative landscape of Lower Mesopotamia for generations, setting the intellectual template for all who would follow. It was the Sumerians who laid the structural foundations, both literally and culturally, for every subsequent empire in the region, including the Babylonians. They established the foundational concept of the city-state, wherein each urban center was viewed as the personal earthly estate of a specific patron deity. In Uruk, the people venerated Inanna, the volatile goddess of love and war. In Ur, they paid devotion to Nana, the god of the moon, while in the ancient sanctuary of Nippur, the priesthood guarded the temple of Enlil, the supreme lord of the wind and cosmic order. This deep-seated religious matrix meant that political authority was permanently intertwined with divine legitimacy. The earthly rulers, initially known as En or Ensi, were not viewed as absolute autocrats ruling by personal whim, but rather as priestly caretakers, divinely sanctioned managers whose primary responsibility was to maintain the delicate balance between the human community and the gods through meticulous ritual observance, temple maintenance, and agricultural management. Babylon itself, located in the central southern neck of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers draw closest to each other, began its historical journey as a modest, unfortified settlement. It lay along a slow-flowing canal connected directly to the Euphrates River, positioned precisely at a critical geographical nexus between the older Sumerian centers to the south and the emerging Akkadian centers to the north. While early historians occasionally overlooked this provincial town, its strategic location would later prove to be an extraordinary geopolitical asset. It sat directly atop the natural overland trade routes that connected the wealthy maritime ports of the Persian Gulf with the mountain networks of Anatolia and the rich resources of the Mediterranean coast. This meant that, Even in its earliest days as a simple agrarian hub, Babylon was continuously exposed to a diverse, fluid movement of merchants, languages, and cultural ideas, preparing its population to become a cosmopolitan center of learning and diplomacy. The earliest known written mention of Babylon appears on a small clay tablet dating to the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, during the prosperous reign of King Shar-Kali-Shari of the Akkadian Empire. This grand empire, founded centuries earlier by the legendary conqueror Sargon of Akkad around 2300 before the Common Era, had been the very first political entity to violently unite the diverse independent city-states of Mesopotamia under a single centralized ruler. Sargon of Akkad had revolutionized ancient statecraft by dismantling local tribal borders, standardizing measurements, and establishing a professional standing military loyal directly to the crown. Although Sargon's empire eventually collapsed under the weight of internal dynastic struggles and devastating external invasions from the Gutian mountain tribes, the memory of its grand political centralization remained an enduring ideal. For centuries after its fall, every ambitious king across Mesopotamia, including the future masters of Babylon, would look back to the Akkadian model as the ultimate standard of imperial legitimacy and universal sovereignty. During this early Akkadian and subsequent post-Akkadian era, Babylon remained firmly in the background of history, overshadowed by older, wealthier, and far more spiritually significant metropolises. Cities like Kish, and Nippur possessed massive temple complexes that attracted thousands of pilgrims and held vast economic wealth in land, livestock, and silver. When the Third Dynasty of commonly known to historians as the III period, re-established a golden age of centralized Sumerian bureaucracy between 2100 and 2000 before the Common Era, Babylon was administered merely as a minor provincial tax district. The meticulous clay ledgers of the III administrators show that Babylon regularly delivered its required quotas of grain, livestock, and labor to the imperial center, its local governors directly appointed by the bureaucrats of Yet, beneath this quiet surface of provincial subordination, the demographic and political foundations of Mesopotamia were beginning to undergo a profound, irreversible shift. The ultimate collapse of the Third Dynasty of around the year 2000, before the Common Era, created a massive, chaotic power vacuum across the entire Near East. The causes of this fall were extraordinarily complex, combining severe environmental disruptions, prolonged agricultural failure due to soil salinization, and a relentless sequence of foreign invasions. From the east, the fierce armies of Elam marched across the Zagros Mountains to sack the city of while from the west, a continuous, massive migration of West Semitic-speaking nomadic tribes known as the Amorites began to stream out of the deserts and highlands of present-day Syria. As the highly structured, centralized bureaucratic state of dissolved into absolute fragmentation, dozens of smaller local principalities erupted into intense competition for regional dominance. It was precisely within this atmospheric crucible of chaos, migration, and structural transformation that the true, independent story of Babylon was destined to emerge from the shadows of history. The massive influx of the Amorite tribes into the Mesopotamian heartland during the turn of the 2nd millennium before the Common Era represented a profound turning point that fundamentally re-architected the social, linguistic, and political topography of the ancient Near East. For centuries, the sedentary urban populations of Sumer and Akkad had viewed these West Semitic-speaking pastoralists as rustic outsiders, describing them in early cuneiform records as nomadic desert dwellers who knew no houses, cultivated no grain, and did not bury their dead in accordance with established civic traditions. However, as the highly centralized state machinery of the Third Dynasty of collapsed into obsolescence under the weight of economic exhaustion and foreign invasions, these nomadic migrations transformed from sporadic frontier incursions into a structural, sweeping settlement across the river valleys. The Amorites did not seek to dismantle or erase the grand cultural achievements of the civilization they encountered. Instead, they demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for cultural assimilation and political adaptation. They rapidly learned the complex Akkadian language, mastered the intricate cuneiform script for administrative documentation, and married into prominent local elite families, blending their own tribal customs with the long-established traditions of Mesopotamian kingship. Within a few generations, ambitious Amorite tribal chieftains and military commanders successfully seized control of dozens of historical city-states across the region, replacing the old priestly bureaucracies with vibrant, highly competitive military dynasties. In cities like Larsa, Isin, Kish, and Eshnunna, these new Amorite leaders began to aggressively jostle for regional dominance, turning the fractured landscape into an arena of intense diplomatic maneuvering and localized warfare. In the midst of this shifting, competitive geopolitical environment, a prominent Amorite leader named Sumu-Abum succeeded in establishing an independent, permanent dynasty in the modest town of Babylon around the traditional year of 1894, before the Common Era. Historically recognized as the official founder of the first dynasty of Babylon, Sumu-Abum's assumption of power marked the definitive moment when Babylon ceased to function as a quiet, provincial tax district of distant empires and transformed into an active, sovereign player on the Mesopotamian stage. Although surviving archaeological records from his specific reign are exceptionally sparse, his actions initiated a deliberate, long-term political template characterized by defensive fortification, infrastructural investment, and cautious territorial expansion that his descendants would meticulously follow for generations. Sumu-Abum's immediate successor, Sumu-La'el, recognized that to preserve the infant dynasty from being swallowed by wealthier neighboring states, Babylon required a secure, defensible agricultural and strategic core. He launched a sequence of highly calculated, localized military campaigns aimed at absorbing nearby towns and critical agricultural canal nodes, successfully bringing the nearby cities of Kish, Sippar, and Dilbat under central Babylonian authority. Rather than acting as a predatory raiding band that plundered and moved on, the early Babylonian kings focused heavily on deep administrative integration. They systematically constructed massive stone fortification walls around Babylon, fortified outlying frontier outposts, and excavated grand new irrigation canals to expand the arable land available for cultivation, directly linking the state's survival to agricultural productivity and population growth. This steady generational expansion continued seamlessly under the subsequent reigns of Sabium, Apil-Sin, and Sine-Mubalit throughout the 19th and early 18th centuries before the Common Era. Each of these rulers inherited a slightly stronger, more resilient kingdom than his predecessor, gradually turning Babylon into a formidable regional force in central Mesopotamia. As the city's political status expanded, its internal ideology underwent a critical transformation, centered primarily on the systematic elevation of its patron deity, Marduk. Originally a minor, obscure local god associated with agricultural fertility and fresh water, Marduk began to receive immense royal patronage. The early kings built and expanded his grand temple sanctuary, the Esagila, gradually crafting a powerful religious narrative that linked the rising political authority of the city directly to the divine will of its patron god, preparing Babylon to challenge the ancient spiritual supremacy of older religious centers like Nippur. To support this expanding state apparatus, the early First Dynasty developed a highly sophisticated, rationalized civil administration that mirrored the structural efficiency of earlier Sumerian and Akkadian models. The royal court trained a specialized caste of professional scribes who recorded transactions, managed grain stores, and drafted official diplomatic correspondence, utilizing a standardized dialect of Old Babylonian Akkadian. Trade networks were aggressively expanded, connecting the markets of Babylon with copper mines in the Persian Gulf, silver networks in Anatolia, and luxury textile markets in distant Elam. Cuneiform clay tablets surviving from this formative era reveal a society transitioning into deep legal and economic complexity, documenting intricate disputes over property lines, contracts between international merchant guilds, and royal decrees regulating interest rates on silver loans. By the closing decades of the reign of King Sin-Muballit, the father of Hammurabi, Babylon had successfully moved from the absolute margins of Near Eastern politics to the very center of a newly emerging geopolitical order. The city was heavily fortified, its treasury was stable, its agricultural base was secure, and its administrative institutions were thoroughly mature. However, the wider regional picture remained exceptionally dangerous and unpredictable. To the south, the powerful Amorite kingdom of Larsa, under the iron-willed rule of King Rim-Sin, controlled much of the wealthy Sumerian heartland. To the northeast, the warlike state of Eshnunna dominated the trade routes along the Diyala River, while to the northwest, the magnificent palace network of Mari governed the upper Euphrates corridor. Babylon stood directly at the crossroads of these competing giants, its survival depending entirely on the tactical willpower, strategic patience, and diplomatic genius of the young prince who was destined to inherit its absolute crown. When Hammurabi came to the throne of Babylon in the early 18th century before the Common Era, few could have predicted the immense scope of his future impact on the ancient world. At the time of his accession, around the year 1792 before the Common Era succeeding his father Sin-Muballit, Babylon was a respectable regional power, stronger than in previous generations, but still completely surrounded by formidable, aggressive rivals. Within a few decades, Hammurabi would not only violently consolidate much of Mesopotamia under his personal rule, but also introduce a monumental legal code that would echo through history for millennia. Hammurabi inherited a growing but still relatively modest kingdom, and his early years on the throne focused heavily on internal consolidation rather than launching immediate, risky military campaigns. He carefully strengthened Babylon's physical infrastructure, improved regional irrigation and canal systems, and invested deeply in the temple economy. These initial efforts successfully secured food production, stabilized the domestic administration, and rapidly increased his legitimacy as a ruler favored by the gods, especially Marduk, the city's chief deity. This structural breathing room allowed him to prepare the state for the inevitable geopolitical storms that loomed along the horizons. The geopolitical environment surrounding Babylon remained extraordinarily tense and unstable. To the south, the rival city of Larsa under the powerful, long-reigning King Rim-Sin controlled much of the agriculturally rich Sumerian land and remained Babylon's primary competitor. To the northeast, Eshnunna held sway over important trade routes along the mountain passes. Mari, along the middle Euphrates, controlled communication lines with Syria and the Levant, while to the east, the kingdom of Elam loomed as a constant, dangerous threat. Hammurabi's genius lay in his strategic patience. For the first 2 decades of his reign, he carefully avoided large-scale warfare, focusing instead on proactive diplomacy, temporary alliances, and gradual, quiet, territorial gains. The ultimate turning point arrived when Hammurabi skillfully forged an alliance with Mari and Elam to directly challenge Larsa's supremacy in the south. Rim-Sin had ruled Larsa for nearly 60 years and had long been the dominant figure in southern Mesopotamia. In one of Hammurabi's most critical and high-stakes military campaigns, he launched a massive offensive that culminated in the total conquest of Larsa around the year 1763, before the Common Era. This victory marked a monumental geopolitical shift, as Babylon instantly absorbed Larsa's economic base and ancient religious centers, gaining absolute control over the fertile southern plains, including historic cities such as Uruk, and Isin. With southern Mesopotamia securely under his control, Hammurabi then turned his veteran legions northward, and his former diplomatic allies quickly became his next strategic targets. He defeated Eshnunna, subduing its rulers and absorbing its territories into his growing provincial network. In a bold and decisive move, he then launched a high-intensity campaign against Mari, whose king, Zimri-Lim, had once been a vital ally. Mari fell to the Babylonian forces, and its grand palace, famous across the ancient world for its extensive archives and administrative sophistication, was burned to the ground. Whether Hammurabi intended to destroy the city permanently or merely punish its deceptive leadership, the outcome was absolute. Babylon was now the undisputed master of Mesopotamia, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the upper Euphrates. What Hammurabi created was not merely a loose patchwork of conquered cities. He sought to centralize his executive authority and bring a profound ideological coherence to his expanding realm, an ambition that culminated in his most enduring historical achievement, the Codex Hammurabi. Inscribed on a tall, dark basalt stele and placed in public view within the heart of the capital, the Code of Hammurabi contained nearly 300 laws, addressing everything from property disputes, international trade, and debt obligations to marriage, labor, and criminal justice. It was written in the clear Akkadian language, the tongue of civil administration, and designed to be accessible not in the sense that all common citizens could read it, but in that its public display signaled the king's unyielding commitment to justice. The prologue of the code offers a fascinating insight into how Hammurabi understood his role as an absolute monarch. He explicitly claimed to have been chosen by the gods to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. This powerful idea that the king was both divinely sanctioned and morally responsible for the protection of his subjects would shape Babylonian political thought for centuries. Many of the laws reflect a strict system of justice based on a rigid social hierarchy, where penalties varied depending on the status of the offender and the victim, classifying society into noblemen, commoners, and slaves. The principle of lex talionis, commonly summarized as an eye for an eye, appeared in several clauses, though it was always tempered by these strict class distinctions. The code also reveals a complex, highly regulated economy, containing laws that governed interest rates, crop failures, commercial transactions, and the liability of builders and merchants. Other clauses meticulously governed family life, including inheritance rights, adoption, adultery, and divorce. In total, the code was a magnificent reflection of a society trying to impose order in a world where uncertainty was common, unifying diverse peoples under a single set of principles. Beyond his legal reforms, Hammurabi continued to engage in large-scale building projects, restoring ancient temples, improving canal systems, and fortifying city walls across his empire. These efforts served both practical and ideological purposes, demonstrating the king's care for his subjects and his close partnership with the divine realm. Temples, in particular, were centers of economic life, and their restoration reinforced Hammurabi's status as a pious and capable ruler. By the end of his 4-decade reign, Babylon was the undisputed center of power in Mesopotamia. Although his empire would struggle to survive his death, the cultural, legal, and ideological legacy of Hammurabi endured, cementing his status as a model king remembered for his governance across global history. The grand empire that King Hammurabi had forged through decades of strategic patience and military brilliance was vast, complex, and magnificent. It stretched from the blue waters of the Persian Gulf in the south, across the fertile river valleys, to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains in the east, and the upper Euphrates corridor in the west. But, as is so often the case in the long, turbulent history of empires, what one extraordinary generation builds, through sheer willpower, the next generation must desperately struggle to hold. Following the death of Hammurabi, around the year 1750, before the Common Era, the first dynasty of Babylon entered a slow, agonizing, and irreversible descent into fragmentation and instability. Over the course of the subsequent century, the central administration weakened, provincial borders eroded, and the state was ultimately undone by a combination of internal social challenges, local rebellions, and devastating external invasions. Hammurabi was succeeded upon the absolute throne by his ambitious but heavily burdened son, Samsu-iluna, who ruled for nearly 3 decades. The structural challenges facing the new monarch were immediate, severe, and relentless. Though he inherited a powerful, wealthy, regional superpower, it was an empire stitched together by very recent conquests, fragile diplomatic alliances, and regional local leaders who had only recently been forcefully subdued by his father's legions. Native loyalty to the Babylonian crown was incredibly thin outside the capital's immediate core, and open resistance quickly erupted across multiple horizons. Early in Samsu-iluna's reign, a massive, well-coordinated rebellion exploded across the southern provinces. Historic Sumerian city-states, that had been absorbed during Hammurabi's final campaigns, such as Uruk, Isin, Larsa, and Ur, rose up in simultaneous, violent revolt against central Babylonian control. These southern revolts were not minor civil disruptions or isolated border skirmishes. They were large-scale, structural uprisings that threatened to permanently sever the southern half of the empire away from the throne. The internal motivations behind these rebellions were deeply rooted in both political and economic grievances. Local provincial elites deeply resented the aggressive political centralization imposed by the Babylonian court, while the common populations were pushed to their limits by the heavy economic burdens of imperial taxation, commodity extractions, and forced conscription for state labor projects. Samsu-Iluna responded to this existential threat with an unyielding iron hand. He mobilized his veteran central armies and launched a sequence of punitive campaigns, suppressing the southern rebellions with extreme kinetic force and systematically destroying key historical cities to prevent any future resistance. The city of Uruk, once a magnificent jewel of Sumerian civilization, was so thoroughly sacked and dismantled by Babylonian troops that it permanently lost its economic importance and never fully recovered its former grandeur. However, the material and psychological cost of sustaining these internal campaigns was monumental for the dynasty. The immense military resources needed to continuously wage war against its own subjects rapidly drained the imperial treasury, while the widespread destruction of southern infrastructure severely weakened the agrarian economy. Seizing upon this moment of central exhaustion, a powerful new domestic rival began to emerge from the vast, swampy marshlands of Lower Mesopotamia near the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the Sealand dynasty. This enigmatic, fiercely independent kingdom was led by local southern elites who had successfully resisted Babylonian centralization, utilizing the difficult, inaccessible terrain of the southern swamps to their absolute tactical advantage. The Sealand rulers managed to carve out an unyielding sphere of influence, effectively severing Babylon's access to the vital maritime trade routes of the Persian Gulf. For generations, successive Babylonian kings would attempt to dislodge the Sealand dynasty, but their military expeditions met with very limited success. Simultaneously, Babylon was losing its grip along the northern and northeastern frontiers. The strategic kingdom of Eshnunna, which had been subdued by Hammurabi, rapidly regained its total independence, and other minor northern principalities quickly followed its example. The grand geopolitical unity that Hammurabi had enforced through statecraft and iron was fracturing at an alarming pace, and Samsu-Iluna spent the remaining years of his exhausting reign simply attempting to defend and hold together the crumbling core of his ancestral lands. The subsequent reigns of his dynastic successors, Abi-Eshu, Ammi-Ditana, Ammi-Saduqa, and Samsu-Ditana, continued this tragic, immutable pattern of gradual territorial decline. Though these kings maintained the formal appearance of imperial control within their royal inscriptions, real administrative power was steadily slipping away from the central court. Faced with a shrinking tax base and a loss of provincial territories, these late kings focused increasingly on domestic religious observance, the preservation of legal continuity, and local infrastructure projects within the capital zone. The reign of Ammi-Saduqa, who governed near the twilight of the dynasty, is particularly notable for its meticulous religious, administrative, and scientific documentation. His royal scribes produced detailed cuneiform tablets recording celestial movements, most famously the detailed observations of the planet Venus, reflecting a growing Babylonian interest in astronomical phenomena. These early empirical records would later form the absolute foundation of Babylon's legendary scientific and astronomical tradition across global history. Yet, while the grand temples of Marduk remained vibrant and active, and the scribes recorded the movements of the stars, Babylon's physical grip on the surrounding Near East continued to loosen, leaving the state isolated, weakened, and completely vulnerable. By the time Samsu-Ditana, the final king of the first dynasty, ascended the absolute throne, the kingdom was a shadow of its former self, completely unprepared for the sudden, cataclysmic external shock that was gathering in the distant north. Around the traditional year of 1595, before the Common Era, a terrifying new military power emerged from the Anatolian highlands, the Hittites. The Hittites, an Indo-European people who had built a powerful, centralized state in central Anatolia, had been aggressively expanding their influence southward into northern Syria. Led by their ambitious, iron-willed King Mursili I, a highly organized, mobile Hittite army marched swiftly down the Euphrates River corridor, bypassing regional local strongholds to launch a surprise, lightning attack directly against the heart of Babylon. In an apocalyptic event that deeply stunned the entire ancient world, the Hittite legions successfully smashed through the city's defenses and brutally sacked Babylon. They plundered its magnificent palaces, stripped its ancient temples of their immense wealth, and carried off the sacred cultural treasures of the city. Mursili I did not intend to permanently occupy or rule Mesopotamia. The campaign appears to have been engineered as a spectacular, high-stakes political raid to amass plunder and project power, rather than an effort at permanent territorial colonization. Having thoroughly broken the city, the Hittite forces retreated back to their northern homeland, leaving behind a smoking, ruined metropolis. The Hittite raid shattered what little remained of the structural integrity of the First Dynasty. King Samsu-ditana perished, or was deposed during the fall of his capital, and with his death, the illustrious royal line that Hammurabi had once made great was completely extinguished from history. Babylon was left leaderless, empty, and exposed to absolute chaos, entering a dark age of deep political fragmentation and structural uncertainty. The collapse of the First Dynasty of Babylon beautifully illustrates the limits of raw military conquest without long-term institutional integration, proving how rapidly an empire can unravel when its central authority fails to maintain the genuine loyalty of its diverse populations. Yet, even amid the ash and ruin of this northern raid, the cultural, legal, and religious identity of Babylon refused to die, waiting quietly beneath the soil for a new power to rebuild its broken altars. In the painful aftermath of the cataclysmic Hittite raid on Babylon and the violent collapse of the First Dynasty, the ancient metropolis was left fractured, depopulated, and structurally vulnerable. Yet, within this dark period of geopolitical disruption and deep administrative vacuum, emerged one of the most remarkable, stable, and long-enduring regimes in the long history of Mesopotamia, the Kassite dynasty. For more than 4 uninterrupted centuries, Kassite kings sat upon the absolute throne of Babylon, making their illustrious family line the single longest-running dynasty in the city's recorded historical ledger. Though historically less glamorous or militarily aggressive than the legendary reign of Hammurabi, this transformative era was absolutely vital for physically rebuilding the broken capital, meticulously preserving traditional Mesopotamian culture, and laying the permanent structural groundwork for Babylon's future imperial revivals. The Kassites were an ancient people of mysterious and heavily debated origin, believed by modern scholars to have originally migrated from the rugged landscapes of the Zagros Mountains region to the east of Mesopotamia. They had been actively present in the military, economic, and political life of the river valleys for multiple generations, frequently serving as highly capable mercenary soldiers, seasonal agricultural laborers, or minor frontier officials under the later kings of Hammurabi's line. Following the profound political vacuum generated by the sudden Hittite retreat, the Kassite chieftains gradually and systematically asserted their authority over Babylon and the surrounding central plains. Their historic rise to supreme power was not characterized by a sudden, bloody conquest. Instead, it unfolded as a slow, peaceful process of consolidation and defensive stabilization during a time of widespread regional chaos. By the early 16th century before the Common Era, a highly capable Kassite king named Agum II, often identified in royal cuneiform inscriptions as Agum Kakrime, had firmly established undisputed Kassite rule over the Babylonian heartland. He possessed an extraordinary political and strategic intellect, instantly portraying his new administration not as a foreign occupation, but as a legitimate, divinely sanctioned protector and restorer of cosmic order and public piety. His most brilliant, highly symbolic act of statecraft was the diplomatic recovery of the sacred cult statue of Marduk, which had been violently plundered from the capital during the earlier Hittite raid and held in distant northern lands. Commander Agum negotiated the safe return of this revered divine image to its ancestral home within the Esagila temple complex. This was far more than a mere religious gesture. It was a masterstroke of political legitimacy designed to tie the new Kassite crown directly to the deep-seated spiritual identity of the native Babylonian populace. What fundamentally set the Kassite rulers apart from other foreign groups across the ancient Near East was their conscious, unyielding decision not to impose their own cultural traditions or language upon the conquered territories. Instead, the Kassite kings meticulously adopted Babylonian culture, administrative models, legal precedents, and linguistic frameworks. They maintained the exclusive use of the Akkadian language in all their official royal records, state decrees, and international correspondence, while continuously donating immense wealth to the traditional Mesopotamian pantheon. The native priesthoods retained their historical privileges, judicial responsibilities, and extensive temple lands, turning the traditional religious elite into primary stakeholders who were deeply invested in the long-term survival of the Kassite state. One of the most defining characteristics of the long Kassite period was its profound administrative stability and sophisticated socio-economic reorganization. The dynasty established a highly centralized, rationalized system of provincial governance, replacing old, volatile tribal borders with clearly defined administrative districts overseen by royal governors who reported directly to the central court. It was during this stable era that land grants became a primary, institutionalized tool of statecraft. The kings regularly awarded large tracts of arable agricultural land to loyal state officials, military commanders, and temple institutions in recognition of distinguished public service. These permanent land transfers were meticulously recorded on kuduru stones, elaborately carved, highly durable boulder boundary markers that listed the exact property lines, the tax exemptions granted to the owner, and a terrifying sequence of divine curses invoked against anyone who attempted to alter, move, or revoke the legal arrangement. These unique boundary artifacts have survived the passage of centuries, providing modern historians with an invaluable, detailed window into the complex legal, economic, and social hierarchy of Kassite society. Driven by this deep domestic stability, the Babylonian economy experienced a long winter of recovery and steady, uninterrupted growth. Agriculture remained the unyielding backbone of state wealth, and successive Kassite monarchs invested heavily from the state treasury to systematically rebuild ancient irrigation canal networks, reclaim vast tracts of abandoned southern land, and protect ordinary farming populations from rural instability. Concurrently, the Kassites aggressively expanded Babylon's international trade connections, transforming the capital into a primary commercial hub that linked the markets of the Persian Gulf with Anatolia, Syria, and the wealthy kingdoms of the Mediterranean coast. High-quality Babylonian textiles, specialized leather goods, agricultural grain surpluses, and finely crafted precious items were continuously exported westward in exchange for vital metals, raw timber, and exotic luxury items. Perhaps the most striking and globally significant achievement of this stable era was Babylon's active, sophisticated participation in international diplomacy. During the 15th and 14th centuries before the Common Era, a period recognized by global historians as the Late Bronze Age, the Kassite kings maintained regular, high-stakes diplomatic relations with the other supreme superpowers of the ancient world, including the Hittites of Anatolia, the Mitanni of northern Mesopotamia, the rising state of Assyria, and the new kingdom of Egypt. This early international system was formalized through continuous diplomatic correspondence, lavish gift exchanges, and strategic royal marriages designed to preserve a delicate geopolitical balance of power. Several important letters from consecutive Kassite monarchs appear within the famous Amarna archive, a collection of official diplomatic texts discovered in Egypt and dated to the prosperous reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten. These fascinating cuneiform clay documents show Kassite rulers directly addressing the Egyptian pharaohs as their brothers, a specific legal term reserved exclusively for monarchs who viewed one another as absolute political equals on the global stage. The formal tone of this international correspondence reveals a world where the king of Babylon negotiated for shipments of Egyptian gold, ivory, and exotic textiles in exchange for Babylonian lapis lazuli, trained horses, and elite wooden chariots, ensuring that Babylon's prestige was felt across the entire civilized world. Culturally, the Kassite period was characterized by deep continuity, intellectual preservation, and meticulous scribal organization rather than radical technical innovation. The traditional scribal schools and temple academies remained exceptionally strong, sponsored directly by the royal court to continuously copy, standardize, and preserve ancient Sumerian and Akkadian literary, legal, and religious texts from the classical past. It was during this stable 400-year era that many of Mesopotamia's greatest epics and scientific manuals were compiled into their definitive standardized forms, ensuring their survival across future generations of global change. However, as the 13th century before the Common Era drew to a close, signs of structural decline and external pressure began to undermine the long stability of the Kassite state. The regional balance of power across the Near East was shifting rapidly and violently. The Hittite Empire was fracturing, the Mitanni had dissolved, and the militaristic state of Assyria to the north was becoming increasingly aggressive and expansionist. The final, cataclysmic blow arrived in the 12th century before the Common Era, launched by Babylon's historical eastern rival, the Kingdom of Elam. Led by their ambitious, iron-willed King Shutruk-Nahunta, a massive Elamite army launched a devastating, full-scale invasion of Mesopotamia, systematically capturing Babylonian cities and defeating the remaining provincial garrisons. Around the traditional year of 1155, before the Common Era, the Elamite forces successfully stormed and captured the city of Babylon itself. They brutally plundered the capital, dismantled its administrative infrastructure, and carried off its immense religious wealth, including the sacred statue of Marduk and the historic code of Hammurabi, dragging them back to their capital at Susa as trophies of war. This dark disaster marked the definitive end of the Kassite dynasty, plunging the state once again into a period of fragmentation. Yet, the monumental accomplishments of the Kassite era could never be erased from history. Their 4 centuries of stable, protective governance had successfully kept Babylon alive during a critical phase of transition, permanently cementing its cultural identity and ensuring that its name would endure to see future eras of imperial glory. As the Kassite dynasty brought long-term administrative stability to the Babylonian heartland, the broader geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East was shifting into one of the most interconnected and sophisticated eras of antiquity. This historical period, recognized by modern scholars as the Late Bronze Age, was defined by the synchronized rise of several powerful regional empires, each continuously vying for territory, raw resources, and symbolic prestige across the Fertile Crescent. To the southwest sat the wealthy New Kingdom of Egypt. To the northwest loomed the formidable Hittite Empire of Anatolia. In northern Mesopotamia lay the Kingdom of Mitanni, while along the upper Tigris River, the militaristic state of Assyria was steadily gathering its strength. Occupying the strategic geographical center of this multipolar world, Kassite Babylon found itself deeply woven into an intricate network of international diplomacy, commercial networks, and occasional strategic warfare. Among Babylon's most complex external interactions during this cosmopolitan era were those conducted with its distant northern neighbors, the Hittites. Operating from their mountainous, heavily fortified capital of Hattusa in central Anatolia, the Hittite monarchs had expanded their sovereign borders rapidly under iron-willed conquerors, establishing themselves as an absolute military superpower across northern Syria and the Levant. Although Babylon and the Hittite heartland were separated by vast distances and rugged terrain, their strategic interests frequently overlapped, particularly regarding the control of vital international trade routes, the manipulation of regional buffer states, and the maintenance of a stable balance of power. Direct military confrontations between Babylon and the Hittites were extraordinarily rare during the 4 centuries of Kassite rule. The famous earlier Hittite raid on Babylon carried out by King Mursili I, which had violently brought an end to Hammurabi's line, had functioned as a swift, predatory strike rather than an attempt at permanent territorial colonization. In the subsequent Kassite era, relations between the two courts shifted from open hostility to a pattern of cautious diplomacy, shared strategic intelligence, and continuous cultural exchange. The two empires recognized that a direct conflict would only exhaust their treasuries and leave their respective borders highly vulnerable to the aggressive expansion of rising third parties like Assyria or Egypt. This long-term geopolitical calculation found its expression in what global historians frequently describe as the first official international system, or the ancient club of great kings. This informal yet highly structured diplomatic framework operated on a strict matrix of relative political equality, guided by carefully worded correspondence, elaborate protocols, regular exchanges of high-level ambassadors, and reciprocal gift-giving. The famous Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt and dating to the 14th century before the Common Era, offer a fascinating, deeply intimate glimpse into the inner mechanics of this ancient statecraft. Within this state archive are several beautifully preserved cuneiform clay tablets sent directly by consecutive Kassite monarchs to the Egyptian pharaohs, including Amenhotep III and the reformist Akhenaten. The tone of these official letters is remarkably sophisticated. The Babylonian rulers systematically address the Egyptian pharaohs as brother, a specific legal term reserved exclusively for monarchs who acknowledged one another as absolute sovereigns on the global stage. These communications reveal that the international system was fueled by a complex prestige economy, where the king of Babylon requested massive shipments of Egyptian gold, fine ivory, and exotic ebony textiles to fund his domestic temple architecture. In return, the Babylonian court dispatched fine lapis lazuli, highly decorated garments, and elite horses bred for the fast wooden chariots of the Egyptian army. However, this ancient balance of power was also characterized by sharp underlying tensions, as honor and parity were fiercely guarded by the royal courts. In several Amarna tablets, Babylonian kings openly complained to the pharaoh that their previous diplomatic gifts were not being reciprocated with equal material value, or that their traveling merchant caravans had been subjected to arbitrary taxes or raids within Egyptian spheres of influence. Strategic royal marriages were also heavily utilized to bind the great powers together, with consecutive Kassite princesses being sent to the luxury courts of Egypt and Anatolia to seal permanent non-aggression treaties, turning dynastic lineage into an absolute tool of geopolitical stability. While Babylon and the Hittites managed their relations primarily through this formal diplomatic network, the borderlands of northern Syria remained a highly volatile arena of strategic competition. Wealthy local city-states shifted their allegiances continuously, depending on which superpower projected the greatest immediate military pressure. Babylonian rulers worked tirelessly to maintain their traditional commercial interests in these Western markets, without provoking a full-scale war with Hattusa, relying on strategic negotiation, financial subsidies to local proxy chieftains, and international treaties, rather than launching high-risk land invasions across the Euphrates. More broadly, this late Bronze Age system generated an unprecedented era of sweeping cultural exchange that permanently left a mark on the ancient world. Babylonian scribal practices, religious concepts, mathematics, and legal traditions profoundly influenced neighboring civilizations. Akkadian, the language of Babylonian administration and scholarship, became the undisputed lingua franca of international diplomacy across the entire Near East. Hittite court officials in Anatolia, Egyptian scribes in Thebes, and local rulers along the Levantine coast were rigorously trained from youth to read and write in the intricate cuneiform script. Even when the Hittites and Egyptians signed their historic peace treaty following the cataclysmic Battle of Kadesh, the final document was drafted and recorded in Babylonian Akkadian, despite neither party speaking the language natively. Babylon's immense religious and literary prestige also expanded its geopolitical influence far beyond its physical borders. Grand mythological texts, such as the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, centered on the cosmic rise of Marduk, were continuously copied, translated, and circulated within royal libraries outside of Mesopotamia. The story's central themes of divine order, cosmic conflict against primordial chaos, and the establishment of centralized monarchical legitimacy resonated deeply with the ruling ideologies of foreign courts. Similarly, Babylonian divination, celestial omens, and astrology spread throughout the region as foreign monarchs actively sought out Babylonian-trained priests to decipher the will of the gods and predict major political or military outcomes. Despite the vast geographical separation, Babylon and the Hittite civilization shared surprisingly similar structural features within their respective royal ideologies. Hittite kings, much like their Babylonian counterparts, portrayed themselves as chosen instruments of the divine realm, responsible for maintaining cosmic justice, building grand temples, and defending the weak from arbitrary oppression. Trade routes connecting the two realms ensured a continuous flow of physical goods and technological ideas. Babylonian artisans produced exceptional luxury pottery, specialized textiles, and intricate bronze work that reached the furthest markets of the Mediterranean, while importing vital timber from the forests of Lebanon, tin from the east, and raw copper from Cyprus. Yet, this flourishing, interconnected late Bronze Age world was inherently fragile, and its long stability was not guaranteed. As the 13th century before the Common Era drew to a close, power dynamics shifted rapidly. The kingdom of Mitanni was systematically dismantled. The Hittite Empire entered a period of deep internal dynastic strain, and the state of Assyria was becoming an increasingly aggressive, expansionist beast right on Babylon's northern doorstep. Babylonian kings responded by continuously strengthening their internal provincial administration, fortifying their borders, and cultivating complex alliances with multiple powers simultaneously, preferring defensive containment over military overextension. The eventual collapse of this international system would throw the entire Near East into chaos, but during the golden centuries of the late Bronze Age, Babylon stood proudly as a diplomatic beacon, a cultural giant whose sophisticated statecraft and timeless learning defined the very peak of ancient civilization. As the 13th century before the Common Era gave way to the 12th, the long-standing stability that had characterized the Kassite dynasty in Babylon began to rapidly unravel. For more than 4 centuries, Kassite monarchs had maintained a relative peace and continuity across central Mesopotamia, successfully integrating their own tribal lineages into the deep-seated cultural, legal, and religious traditions of the native Babylonian world. They had transformed themselves from rustic mountain outsiders into pious, legitimate defenders of the Sunni-like traditional Mesopotamian order, ruling with a balanced combination of foreign dynastic solidarity and local administrative adaptation. However, the international matrix of the late Bronze Age was undergoing a violent, systemic collapse, and Babylon could not remain immune to the rising predatory pressures gathering along its borders. The weakening of Kassite authority within Mesopotamia did not occur as an overnight catastrophe. Rather, it was the structural consequence of a slow, generational erosion of economic and military influence. The central state treasury was heavily strained by the disruption of international trade routes, as the mysterious collapse of the Hittite Empire and the widespread destruction of Levantine coastal cities by the Sea Peoples severed Babylon from its traditional Western markets. This economic contraction triggered immediate domestic vulnerabilities, as local provincial elites and independent tribal groups along the Euphrates began to slowly withhold their agricultural taxes from the capital. Seizing upon this moment of visible imperial fatigue, Babylon's most ancient and relentless geopolitical rival to the east prepared to strike a definitive blow: the Kingdom of Elam. Situated within the rugged highlands and low alluvial plains of present-day southwestern Iran, Elam had functioned as a formidable counterweight to Mesopotamian power since the very dawn of human history. For centuries, Elamite rulers had alternated between active commercial partnership and high-intensity frontier warfare with successive Babylonian regimes. By the mid-12th century before the Common Era, Elam was experiencing a magnificent, highly nationalistic military resurgence under a series of iron-willed, ambitious monarchs. The most consequential and terrifying of these figures was King Shutruk-Nahunte, whose reign would mark a catastrophic turning point in Babylonian-Elamite relations. Instead of merely launching sporadic border raids to plunder livestock or secure mountain trade passes, Shutruk-Nahunte organized a massive, multi-front land invasion of the Mesopotamian heartland with the explicit, strategic intent of permanently breaking Kassite power. The Elamite king did not frame his military campaign merely as a predatory war for material land acquisition. Instead, he skillfully justified his invasion in deep religious and ideological terms. Shutruk-Nahunte claimed to be acting as the chosen arm of the supreme Elamite deity in Shushinak, marching westward to punish the Babylonian court for perceived historical offenses and restore a divine balance of power. This calculated rhetoric was deeply typical of ancient Near Eastern statecraft, where monarchs systematically utilized divine sanction to mobilize their populations and legitimize the brutal violence of campaign. In this specific conflict, it also served as a direct psychological justification for the total, systematic desecration of Babylon's most sacred cultural and spiritual sanctuaries. The Elamite campaign proved to be structurally devastating for the Kassite state. Shutruk-Nahunte's highly mobile armies, utilizing swift mountain tactical maneuvers and superior bronze weaponry, advanced deep into Mesopotamia, methodically crushing provincial garrisons and capturing vital urban centers along the Tigris River. The city of Babylon itself, suffering from a severe lack of central coordination and local elite defection, was successfully stormed and occupied by the Elamite forces. The conquerors unleashed a remorseless plunder of the capital, systematically targeting the great temples and the private palaces of the aristocracy to strip them of their immense physical wealth. Most critically, the Elamites seized and carried off the ultimate symbolic prizes of Babylonian civilization. They removed the sacred, revered cult statue of Marduk from the Esagila temple, along with the historic basalt stele of the Code of Hammurabi and the victory monuments of early Akkadian kings, dragging them across the river valleys and up into the mountain strongholds of their capital at Susa. This grand act of cultural theft was far more than a material humiliation. It struck directly at the psychological heart of Babylonian identity. Within the Mesopotamian worldview, the forced removal of Marduk's physical statue was interpreted as an absolute spiritual crisis, a visible sign that the chief deity had grown profoundly angry with his people, abandoned his earthly city, and permitted foreign heathens to dismantle the realm. The final Kassite monarch, King Enlil-nadin-Ahi, attempted to mobilize a desperate guerrilla resistance against the occupiers from the southern provincial marshlands. But his lines were swiftly encircled, outmaneuvered, and utterly decimated by the Elamite vanguard around the traditional year of 1155 before the Common Era. Enlil-nadin-Ahi was captured in chains and taken as a royal prisoner of war to Susa, where he likely perished in lonely captivity, bringing a definitive, blood-stained end to the Kassite dynasty. With the fall of this long-lived royal house, Babylon descended into a dark winter of intense political fragmentation, social dislocation, and foreign economic monitoring, its central administration completely shattered. The immediate occupation of Babylon by the Elamites, however, proved to be historically short-lived. The conquerors lacked the administrative manpower required to permanently govern a vast, hostile Mesopotamian population far from their ancestral mountain core, and within a few decades, domestic succession crises inside Elam forced their main garrisons to retreat back across the eastern borders. Yet, the systemic damage inflicted upon Babylon was profound and lasting. The Elamite invasion had violently destroyed the delicate provincial tax networks, humiliated the traditional priesthood, and shattered the multi-century illusion of political continuity that the Kassites had worked so tirelessly to maintain. In the chaotic wake of this eastern retreat, a series of short-lived, highly localized native dynasties emerged across southern and central Mesopotamia, each desperately attempting to restore public order and claim the sovereign legacy of the throne. These included the Second Sealand dynasty, which operated with considerable autonomy from the swampy, inaccessible marshlands near the Persian Gulf, and the fourth dynasty of Babylon, commonly known as the Second Dynasty of Isin. Led by native Amorite Akkadian elites, the kings of Isin launched an intense cultural and military campaign to reassert central control over the traditional core of Babylonia, emphasizing their deep-seated ancestral ties to ancient traditions, rebuilding shattered local irrigation networks, and issuing royal inscriptions that claimed absolute continuity with the Golden Past. Yet, these native restoration efforts were inherently reactive rather than visionary, focused entirely on repairing immediate domestic damage rather than modernizing the state's internal architecture or expanding its external influence. The strategic center of gravity in Mesopotamia was shifting permanently, and Babylon found itself struggling merely to remain politically relevant in a rapidly transforming world. While the city's scribes continued to meticulously copy ancient legal texts, and its priests recited solemn hymns to the absent Marduk, a terrifying, highly centralized, and relentlessly militarized superpower was rapidly gathering strength along the northern horizon, the Neo-Assyrian state. Babylon was stepping out of the ashes of the Kassite collapse, only to confront a multi-generational era of northern domination, where its survival would depend not on independent military dictation, but on its profound cultural resilience and its unyielding desire to reclaim its stolen gods. In the prolonged wake of the Kassite collapse and the severe dislocation caused by the Elamite retreat, Babylon found itself trapped within an unstable cycle of short-lived native dynasties that desperately struggled to maintain a coherent central administration. While local regimes, such as the Second Dynasty of Isin, achieved temporary military respirations and invested heavily in traditional cultural propaganda, they were ultimately unable to unify the fragmented Mesopotamian landscape or construct a durable professional standing army. This persistent domestic vulnerability unfolded precisely as a terrifying, highly centralized, and relentlessly militarized superpower was aggressively gathering momentum along the upper Tigris River corridor. The Middle Assyrian Kingdom, which would eventually evolve into the absolute juggernaut of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Assyria had originally existed as a modest, highly localized kingdom centered around the ancient sacred city of Ashur. However, through a multi-generational process of intense societal professionalization, iron-willed military mobilization, and radical administrative centralization, the Assyrians systematically refashioned their state into an uncompromising expansionist machine. Their royal ideology was deeply anchored to an absolute strategic mandate. The supreme Assyrian national deity, Ashur, demanded the continuous geopolitical subjugation of surrounding lands to bring divine order to a chaotic world. Unlike the Babylonians, who frequently relied on indirect rule, shifting tribal alliances, and flexible commercial diplomacy, the Assyrians engineered a devastatingly effective war machine centered on highly disciplined standing infantry divisions, specialized siege engineering units, and mass psychological terror as a tool of statecraft. Sensing the acute political disarray paralyzing southern Mesopotamia during the late 14th century before the Common Era, the ambitious Assyrian monarch Ashur-uballit I initiated a pattern of direct intervention in Babylonian internal affairs. He skillfully utilized dynastic marriage diplomacy to bind the two royal houses together, a calculated legal move that granted him a permanent pretext to intervene as a regional protector when local factions rebelled against his family interests. When anti-Assyrian noble elements within the Babylonian court assassinated his grandson, who had been placed upon the southern throne, Ashur-uballit marched his veteran legions swiftly southward. He brutally suppressed the court faction, restored order, and installed his own preferred proxy ruler, initiating a multi-century era of forced vassalage and strategic containment that would alter the historical trajectory of Babylon forever. These initial Assyrian interventions were characterized by a degree of geopolitical restraint, as the early northern kings preferred to rule Babylon through native proxies who offered formal oaths of allegiance, paid continuous material tribute, and coordinated their foreign policies directly with the court of Nineveh or Ashur. However, Beneath this surface of formal subordination, a deep, smouldering reservoir of resentment was expanding among native Babylonian elites, merchants, and the highly influential priesthood of Marduk. Within the Babylonian worldview, the king was not an absolute autocrat, but a pious priestly caretaker whose authority had to be ritually validated each year by grasping the hands of the statue of Marduk within the Esagila temple. Any ruler who relied on foreign northern bayonets or failed to demonstrate absolute devotion to the local cults was viewed as fundamentally illegitimate, a toxic usurpation that invited popular rebellion. This structural friction reached a catastrophic and highly explosive climax during the 13th century before the Common Era under the reign of the iron-willed Assyrian monarch Tukulti-Ninurta I. Growing profoundly weary of continuous Babylonian defiance and hidden diplomatic alignments with external rivals, Tukulti-Ninurta abandoned the traditional template of indirect proxy rule and launched a massive, full-scale land invasion of southern Mesopotamia. His veteran central forces successfully overwhelmed the local Babylonian defensive lines, stormed the capital, and took absolute executive control of the state, marking the very first time an Assyrian king formally declared himself the absolute monarch of Babylon. To deliver a decisive, unforgettable lesson to his rebellious subjects, Tukulti-Ninurta executed a sequence of actions that deeply shocked the entire ancient world. He ordered his troops to thoroughly plunder the ancient palaces, dismantle sections of the city walls, and systematically desecrate the most sacred sanctuaries. Most dramatically, he violently removed the revered cult statue of Marduk from the Esagila and dragged it away as a prisoner of war to his northern capital. Within the religious psychology of the Near East, this act of divine kidnapping was catastrophic. It signaled to the population that the supreme king of the gods had been formally defeated or had permanently abandoned his city due to their sins, plunging Babylon into a prolonged winter of spiritual crisis and moral exhaustion. Yet, this exercise in brute kinetic violence ultimately proved to be a severe operational and theological failure for the Assyrian crown. The desecration of Babylon's sacred institutions provoked widespread outrage, not only among the native southern populations, who launched immediate underground resistance movements, but also within Assyria's own conservative religious elite. Many high-ranking Assyrian scholars and priests viewed the humiliation of Marduk, a deity they also deeply respected within the shared Mesopotamian pantheon, as a dangerous sacrilege that risked alienating the divine realm and inviting cosmic retribution upon their own dynasty. This internal structural tension quickly turned into deep palace paranoia, culminating in a violent court conspiracy wherein Tukulti-Ninurta I was assassinated by his own sons inside his royal pavilion, plunging Assyria into a temporary era of succession crisis. Following the sudden death of the northern conqueror, Babylon managed to regain a partial measure of its political autonomy, successfully recovering the statue of Marduk and restoring its traditional religious rituals. However, the structural pattern of northern interference had been permanently set, and for the subsequent few centuries, Babylon's geopolitical reality was entirely shaped by the looming, terrifying presence of the expanding Assyrian state. Whenever Assyria suffered from temporary dynastic instability or foreign wars along its mountain horizons, Babylonian kings would boldly declare absolute independence. But whenever a strong, energetic new monarch ascended the northern throne, the armies of Ashur would march southward to reimpose a suffocating vassalage, turning the ancient land into a volatile theatre of permanent, high-stakes, strategic friction. By the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was entering an unprecedented, far more aggressive phase of imperial consolidation. In previous generations, Assyrian rulers had been largely content with an erratic pattern of tributary arrangements, shifting puppet alliances, and periodic punitive campaigns to maintain overall hegemony over the southern alluvial plains. However, this loose framework of indirect control proved to be structurally fragile, continually plunging Babylonia into cycles of political intrigue, localized civil conflict, and anti-Assyrian noble conspiracies. When the brilliant, iron-willed administrative reformer Tiglath-Pileser III ascended the northern imperial throne, he resolved to completely abandon the old, inconsistent methods of containment and implement a radical, direct template of political absorption that would fundamentally re-architect the administrative anatomy of Babylon. Tiglath-Pileser III came to power in Assyria around the year 745 before the Common Era, amidst a severe domestic crisis, likely securing the royal fasces through a violent palace coup. He immediately initiated a profound, comprehensive reorganization of the entire Assyrian imperial architecture, systematically breaking down large, overly independent provincial territories into smaller, tightly regulated administrative units overseen by governors appointed directly by and fiercely loyal to the central crown. This massive structural adjustment allowed the imperial center to extract material resources, agricultural taxes, and military conscripts with a raw, calculated efficiency never before seen in the ancient world. The new, uncompromising model of direct provincial annexation was destined to be applied directly to the proud, ancient city-state of Babylon. At the absolute outset of Tiglath-Pileser's rise in the north, Babylon was governed by King Nebuchadnezzar, a native ruler who had managed to maintain a fragile domestic peace across central Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar's reign is highly celebrated in global intellectual history for its profound investment in the preservation of cultural memory, scientific records, and meticulous historical documentation. He initiated a highly systematic, continuous chronological ledger that modern astronomers and historians would later utilize as the absolute foundational framework for dating major historical events across antiquity. Although Nebuchadnezzar maintained the formal appearance of independent sovereignty, the stark geopolitical reality was that his court operated under the quiet shadow of Assyrian military dominance, paying a steady flow of material tribute to ensure that the northern war machine remained north of the horizon. When King Nebuchadnezzar passed away, Babylon was instantly thrown into a chaotic vortex of domestic factional wars. Competing aristocratic elements, local city notable families, and independent tribal chieftains violently vied for control of the vacant throne, and the imperial center at Nineveh saw an absolute, strategic opportunity to intervene. Tiglath-Pileser III marched his veteran central legions swiftly southward into Babylonia, systematically crushing local resistance, deposing the brief usurpers, and executing an unprecedented political masterstroke in the year 729 before the Common Era. He formally proclaimed himself the absolute king of Babylon, uniting the dual crowns of Assyria and Babylonia upon a single head. Tiglath-Pileser's assumption of the ancient Babylonian crown was a calculated, brilliant combination of raw military muscle and sophisticated religious propaganda. He was perfectly aware that Babylon possessed an immense standard of spiritual authority and cultural prestige that raw kinetic force alone could never fully subdue. To legitimize his direct rule in the eyes of his new subjects, the northern conqueror meticulously conformed to local traditions. He entered the gates of the capital as a pious protector, participated directly in the sacred New Year rituals, and personally grasped the hands of the statue of Marduk within the Esagila temple sanctuary, effectively binding his foreign imperial dynasty directly to the sacred, divine covenant of the Babylonian state. This dual monarchy strategy was partially successful in the opening years. Significant portions of the urban Babylonian elite and the traditional priesthood accepted his direct rule, viewing the stability of a strong northern monarch as far preferable to the constant threat of rural anarchy, trade route disruption, or meddling from external regional competitors. Under his direct oversight, the temples continued to function without interruption, property rights were legally protected, and international commerce remained highly active. However, beneath this polished surface of imperial integration, a deep, smouldering current of native resentment remained entirely alive. To many patriotic Babylonians, the presence of Assyrian administrative officials within the civic centers was a permanent humiliation, an absolute foreign occupation that stripped the city of its historical right to self-determination. Compounding this underlying domestic tension was the rapid, aggressive rise of a dynamic new political force in the southern marshlands of Lower Mesopotamia, the Chaldeans. Though frequently characterized in Assyrian royal inscriptions as semi-nomadic outsiders or disruptive tribal groups, the Chaldeans were a highly sophisticated, politically astute, Semitic-speaking people who had become deeply integrated into the wider economic and agricultural fabric of Babylonian society. The various Chaldean clans controlled wealthy trade routes along the Euphrates canals and possessed an unyielding desire for independent political power. As the centralization policies of Tiglath-Pileser III systematically stripped away the traditional autonomy of the southern regions, the Chaldean chieftains began to actively position themselves as the true, legitimate champions of native Babylonian self-rule, waiting with absolute patience for the strategic moment when the northern titan would falter. The dual monarchy framework instituted by Tiglath-Pileser III placed an immense, continuous strain upon his successors, creating deep structural contradictions that proved almost impossible to resolve over the long term. While the Assyrian crown was expected to act as a pious, protective patron of Babylonian temples and laws, it was simultaneously forced to function as an extraction machine, demanding heavy tribute to fund the empire's relentless military campaigns across Egypt and the Levant. This persistent dual identity as both legitimate local king and foreign imperial occupier fostered an intense crystallization of a distinct Babylonian identity in direct opposition to northern rule. Babylon continued to dream of absolute freedom, and those unyielding dreams would soon find powerful, charismatic champions prepared to ignite a multi-generational era of explosive, global revolutionary conflict. Part 10. Marduk-apla-iddina II and the Chaldean resistance. Following the administrative experiments of Tiglath-Pileser III, Babylon found itself trapped in an increasingly unstable and deeply resentful position. Though formally integrated into the dual monarchy framework of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the ancient metropolis remained a proud cultural sentinel, its traditional elites, wealthy merchant guilds, and powerful priesthood deeply resistant to foreign northern dictation. The city's forced subordination was viewed by many native Babylonians not as a permanent political reality, but as a temporary humiliation that required active resistance. This smoldering desire for self-determination would find its ultimate expression and its most formidable geopolitical champion in a dynamic and calculating force rising from the southern marshlands, the Chaldean tribes, led by a man whose very name would become a multi-generational symbol of unyielding defiance. The Chaldeans were a Semitic-speaking people who had long inhabited the complex, swampy lowlands of Lower Mesopotamia, shifting between pastoralism, intensive canal agriculture, and the management of lucrative maritime trade networks near the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Organized into powerful, heavily armed tribal confederations known as houses such as Bit Dakuri, Bit Amukani, and Bit Yakin, the Chaldean clans were politically sophisticated, militarily adaptable, and deeply interwoven into the wider fabric of Babylonian society. As Assyrian direct rule began to systematically reduce the autonomy of the traditional urban centers, the Chaldean chieftains recognized that the widespread domestic discontent across Babylonia offered a magnificent opportunity to challenge the northern superpower and claim the ultimate prize of the southern world, the absolute throne of Babylon. The most brilliant and relentless of these tribal leaders was Marduk-apla-iddina II, known in later classical and biblical traditions as Merodach-Baladan. A prince of the royal house of Bit Yakin, Marduk-apla-iddina possessed an extraordinary combination of personal charisma, military willpower, and diplomatic cunning. He looked upon the continuous geopolitical friction between Assyria and Babylon not merely as a border dispute, but as an absolute arena for national liberation. In the winter of 722 before the Common Era, his strategic moment arrived. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was suddenly plunged into an intense internal leadership crisis following the unexpected death of King Shalmaneser V, whose armies were tied down in prolonged campaigns across the Levant. Seizing this precise moment of northern distraction, Marduk-apla-iddina II marched his veteran Chaldean horsemen out of the southern marshes and entered the gates of Babylon, where he was immediately welcomed as a legitimate native liberator. The powerful traditional priesthood of Marduk and the city's merchant aristocracies enthusiastically threw their support behind his coup, officially declaring him the absolute king of Babylon. To reinforce his native legitimacy and erase decades of Assyrian humiliation, the new monarch immediately restored lost properties to the temples, exempted the holy cities from punitive imperial taxes, and performed the sacred ritual of grasping the hands of the statue of Marduk, signaling to the population that the divine presence had once again smiled upon a native sovereign. Marduk Apla-Iddina II recognized with complete clarity that a single localized victory would not keep the Assyrian war machine at bay forever. He initiated a highly sophisticated, multi-front diplomatic campaign to construct a powerful international coalition capable of encircling Assyria. He forged a deep, durable military alliance with Elam, Babylon's ancient eastern neighbor, ensuring that the heavy Elamite cavalry could protect his flank. Concurrently, he dispatched secret envoys across the desert trade routes to independent kingdoms in the Levant and Palestine, including the Kingdom of Judah under King Hezekiah, coordinating simultaneous, widespread anti-Assyrian rebellions to permanently scatter the northern forces. For nearly 12 uninterrupted years, this brilliant coalition successfully defied the expanding power of the empire, allowing Babylon to breathe as an independent, sovereign state. However, the northern titan was far from broken. In Assyria, a fierce, highly capable military administrator had consolidated his power. Sargon II, the founder of the illustrious Sargonid dynasty. Sargon II viewed the independent Chaldean regime in Babylon as an intolerable threat to the structural integrity of his empire. In the year 710 before the Common Era, having successfully crushed the Western rebellions, Sargon turned the absolute weight of his professional standing army southward, launching a massive, high-intensity invasion of Babylonia to restore northern dominance. The decisive confrontation unfolded along the highly contested borderlands near the city of Dur, where Sargon's highly disciplined, armor-clad infantry divisions and heavy war chariots systematically clashed with the combined forces of the Babylonian-Chaldean alliance. Despite individual tribal bravery and the assistance of Elamite contingents, the technical superiority and overwhelming kinetic force of the Assyrian military machine shattered the coalition lines. Recognizing that his defenses were completely compromised, Marduk Apla-Iddina II executed a strategic retreat, fleeing the capital to seek safety among his ancestral marshlands in the far south, leaving Babylon open to the advancing conqueror. Sargon II entered the captured metropolis not as a remorseless plunderer, but with a highly calculated policy of conciliation and cultural respect. He took the title of King of Babylon, alongside his Assyrian crown, funded the immediate reconstruction of damaged local temples, and carefully protected the privileges of the priesthood to win their institutional loyalty. Yet, the underlying political friction was far from resolved. When Sargon II perished unexpectedly in battle along the northern mountain frontiers in 705 before the Common Era, the unyielding Marduk Apla-Iddina II instantly emerged from his hidden southern sanctuaries, mobilized a renewed tribal vanguard, and seized the Babylonian throne for a dramatic second reign. Though this second rebellion lasted only a brief 9 months before being crushed by Sargon's fierce successor, Sennacherib, it beautifully demonstrated that the Babylonian desire for self-rule was an unquenchable flame, setting the stage for a dark, cataclysmic cycle of total imperial vengeance that would soon bring the ancient capital to absolute ruin. The long-standing tension between Babylon and Assyria reached its most violent, tragic, and symbolic climax during the reign of Sennacherib, one of Assyria's most powerful, iron-willed, and highly controversial monarchs. After decades of relentless southern rebellions, shifting tribal alliances, and failed administrative reconciliations, the Babylonian problem had transformed into an intolerable, existential burden for the Neo-Assyrian imperial state. What followed was a radical act of political violence, virtually unprecedented in the long history of the ancient Near East. The deliberate, systematic destruction of Babylon, a metropolis long regarded by both northerners and southerners alike as a sacred, inviolable sanctuary and the absolute cultural center of the civilized world. Sennacherib ascended the absolute throne of Assyria in the year 705 before the Common Era, following the sudden battlefield death of his father, Sargon II. Though inheriting a vast, wealthy empire that stretched across the Fertile Crescent, he also inherited the permanent volatility of Babylon, a city repeatedly associated with subterranean noble plots and anti-imperial unrest. The memory of Marduk-apla-iddina's long defiance was entirely fresh within the minds of the northern generals, and Sennacherib approached the southern capital not with traditional religious reverence, but with a deep, unyielding suspicion. From the absolute outset of his reign, he resolved to abandon his father's conciliatory diplomacy, preferring a much harsher template of military dictation to reassert control over southern Mesopotamia. Early in his campaigns, Sennacherib moved swiftly against the returned Marduk-apla-iddina, decisively routing his Chaldean cavalry forces and permanently expelling him from the city gates. But the internal political fabric of Babylon remained dangerously unstable. A volatile mixture of local factions, Aramean horsemen, independent Chaldean clans, and disaffected Babylonian elites continually competed for dominance, routinely inviting military intervention from the neighboring kingdom of Elam and threatening the structural integrity of Assyria's southern border. Growing weary of these cycles of native betrayal, Sennacherib executed a bold dynastic move. He installed his own beloved eldest son and designated imperial heir, Ashur-nadin-shumi, upon the absolute throne of Babylon. This strategic appointment, intended to ensure permanent southern loyalty to the northern crown, only served to further inflame the smouldering currents of Babylonian patriotism. To the proud citizens and traditional priesthood of the capital, the placement of a regular Assyrian prince on their ancestral throne was a direct, unforgivable affront to their cultural identity. Matters worsened catastrophically around the year 694 before the Common Era, when a powerful Elamite army, collaborating directly with rebellious Babylonian nobles, launched a surprise raid against the city. The conspirators successfully captured the young prince, Ashur-nadin-shumi, and carried him away in chains to distant Elam, where he likely perished in lonely captivity. The sudden loss of his son and heir enraged Sennacherib, transforming his political frustration into a deep, consuming personal vendetta against the southern metropolis. He launched a devastating, multi-year, punitive campaign across Babylonia, methodically crushing the Elamite relief contingents and systematically isolating the capital from its regional allies. By the winter of 689 before the Common Era, his veteran standing divisions had completely encircled Babylon, subjecting the starving population to a long, brutal military siege. When the city walls were finally breached by northern battering rams, Sennacherib resolved to go far beyond temporary suppression or political execution. He determined to erase the city from the face of the earth. According to his own triumphant cuneiform inscriptions, Sennacherib ordered his troops to thoroughly plunder the grand palaces, dismantle the stone masonry, and systematically raze the ancient temples to the ground. To ensure the complete physical annihilation of the metropolis, he commanded his engineers to divert the immediate waters of the Euphrates River, digging brand new channels directly through the heart of the residential quarters to flood the pulverized ruins and turn the imperial center into a desolate, muddy swamp. The houses were dismantled brick by brick, the massive defensive walls were torn down, and the revered, sacred cult statue of Marduk was violently shattered or dragged away as a humiliated trophy of war to the northern capital of Ashur. Sennacherib portrayed his remorseless actions in terms of absolute cosmic justice, claiming in his royal propaganda that the gods, deeply angered by Babylon's repeated oaths-breaking, had personally sanctioned the total annihilation of the city. In his own unyielding words, he boasted that he had swept away the populace like a roaring hurricane, laying the city's deep-founded architectural foundations bare to the wind. But this act of brute kinetic force sent shockwaves of unease across the entire Near East. Within the shared Mesopotamian religious psychology, Babylon held a unique, sacred status as the center of human learning and the earthly home of the king of the gods, and destroying it was viewed by many, even within Assyria's own conservative religious elite, as a dangerous, catastrophic sacrilege. The total desecration of Babylon cast a dark, permanent shadow over Sennacherib's imperial legacy. Although he continued to govern his empire with an iron fist for more than a decade after the event, devoting immense state wealth to the grand architectural reconstruction of his northern capital at Nineveh, his reputation was permanently marked by his handling of the holy city. Many contemporary and subsequent accounts increasingly interpreted his actions not as a triumph of order, but as a moral stain that risked inviting divine retribution upon his entire lineage. When Sennacherib was eventually assassinated in the winter of 681 before the Common Era, a violent regicide carried out by his own disgruntled elder sons inside a temple pavilion, the ancient world looked upon his death as a definitive act of divine vengeance for the broken altars of Babylon. The ruins of Babylon, left desolate by Sennacherib's fury, stood as a grim testament to the catastrophic costs of imperial wrath. But the ancient city's story was far from over. Following the assassination of Sennacherib in the winter of 681 before the Common Era, a surprising and transformative chapter of renewal began under his successor, Esarhaddon. In stark contrast to his father's uncompromising policy of destruction, Esarhaddon adopted an institutionalized template of political reconciliation and spiritual restoration toward the south. His actions would not only physically revive the broken metropolis, but also fundamentally alter the course of Neo-Assyrian administrative policy for years to come. Esarhaddon came to the Assyrian absolute throne under exceptionally dramatic and violent circumstances. Emerging victorious from a brief but intense civil war against his older brothers who had orchestrated their father's regicide, the young monarch faced immediate structural challenges. To secure his fragile position, he needed to rapidly project an image of supreme divine favor, while simultaneously correcting what many within his empire, particularly across Babylonia, viewed as the severe theological and moral offenses committed by his predecessor. From the absolute outset of his reign, Esarhaddon made it clear that he would take a completely different strategic path. His royal inscriptions were meticulously filled with the language of piety, deep repentance, and absolute respect for Babylon's sacred traditions. Rather than attempting to erase the memory of the destruction, Esarhaddon openly acknowledged the catastrophe, but brilliantly framed it through a unique theological narrative. He argued that the chief deity, Marduk, had grown profoundly angry with the city's previous citizens due to their social corruption, and had decreed its abandonment for 70 years. However, displaying divine mercy, Marduk had quickly turned the cuneiform tablet of destiny upside down, transforming the number 70 into 11 years, and personally selected Esarhaddon to act as his chosen earthly agent, tasked with restoring cosmic order and harmony between Assyria and the divine realm. One of Esarhaddon's earliest and most highly symbolic acts of statecraft was the formal restoration of the sacred cult statue of Marduk to Babylon. This massive event possessed an immense spiritual and psychological significance for the entire Near East. By bringing the divine image back from its northern exile, Esarhaddon signaled to the native populations that the divine presence had officially forgiven his subjects, and that Babylon was once again a legitimate, divinely protected religious center. This symbolic reconciliation was accompanied by a monumental, state-funded reconstruction program that required massive financial resources, extensive labor, and careful political monitoring. The king of Assyria ordered his master builders to completely clear the mud and river debris from the residential quarters, systematically rebuilding the ancient city walls, the grand processional avenues, and the major administrative complexes brick by brick. His primary architectural priority was the comprehensive restoration of the great Esagila temple complex, along with its towering ziggurat, the Etemenanki. Esarhaddon's royal inscriptions detail the ceremonial precision of this reconstruction, documenting how he personally mixed the initial mud mortar with fine oil, wine, and honey, and carried the very first ceremonial brick upon his own royal shoulders, in accordance with ancient Mesopotamian customs, presenting himself not as a foreign occupier, but as a traditional, pious builder king. Politically, Esarhaddon worked tirelessly to mend relations with the traditional Babylonian aristocracy. He officially restored vast tracts of confiscated land and ancient legal privileges to the prominent priestly and merchant families who had been disenfranchised under his father's rule. He also reappointed native Babylonian civil servants to high positions within the provincial administration, allowing a considerable degree of local self-governance while maintaining overall Assyrian imperial monitoring. This strategy of deliberate inclusion succeeded in diffusing much of the intense animosity that had characterized the South for decades, establishing a prolonged winter of relative peace and economic respiration. Furthermore, Esarhaddon utilized a revitalized Babylon as a strategic platform for broader diplomatic initiatives across the southern frontiers. He successfully exchanged high-level ambassadors with the neighboring kingdom of Elam, negotiating complex non-aggression treaties that effectively minimized the threat of renewed external meddling along the lower Euphrates canals. These diplomatic achievements allowed the imperial center to focus its professional military divisions on other crucial fronts, culminating in Esarhaddon's spectacular and highly lucrative conquest of Lower Egypt. Yet, throughout these sweeping international triumphs, the physical and spiritual stabilization of Babylon remained an absolute priority for his court. Culturally, the ancient city experienced a magnificent intellectual renaissance during this era of restoration. The great temple academies and scribal schools resumed their historical roles as primary centers of advanced learning. Scribes and scholars actively produced and standardized vast bodies of legal, mathematical, and astronomical texts. Esarhaddon's court heavily supported this scholarly revival, facilitating a profound transmission of classical Babylonian learning directly to Assyrian intellectual centers like Nineveh. This extensive exchange of knowledge would become even more pronounced under Esarhaddon's son and successor, Ashurbanipal, who would later build his legendary royal library using thousands of cuneiform texts, meticulously copied from these Babylonian originals. The reconciliation policies implemented by Esarhaddon were not without their critics within the Assyrian heartland. Significant factions within the northern military elite and the conservative priesthood of Ashur likely viewed the massive investment of imperial funds into the reconstruction of a traditionally rebellious city as highly wasteful and strategically risky. The memory of Babylon's repeated betrayals remained fresh, and fears of a future southern uprising persisted. But Esarhaddon remained unyieldingly committed to his grand vision of imperial balance, convinced that a stable, prosperous, and grateful Babylon was a far more effective tool for securing the southern half of his empire than a ruined, resentful wasteland. Toward the final years of his reign, as his physical health began to falter, Esarhaddon made a carefully orchestrated, highly unprecedented decision regarding the imperial succession to preserve this delicate harmony between the two realms after his death. He formally appointed his eldest son, Shamash-shum-ukin, to inherit the absolute throne of Babylon, while designating his younger, highly capable son, Ashur-banipal, to assume supreme command over the primary imperial center of Assyria. This unique dual kingship arrangement was engineered as a pragmatic compromise to satisfy both nations. Babylon would be governed directly by a royal heir trained in local customs and laws, granting the city the dignity of its own resident monarch, while Assyria would retain absolute military and administrative hegemony over the wider empire. In theory, this succession plan was an elegant masterstroke of flexible diplomacy and institutional balance. In practice, however, it introduced a dangerous structural flaw that completely underestimated the unyielding power of personal ambition and deep-seated national pride. While Esarhaddon passed away peacefully during a military expedition in the early 7th century before the Common Era, remembered across Babylonia not as a foreign oppressor, but as a just and magnificent restorer of holy altars, his divided inheritance had already planted the explosive seeds for one of the most tragic, destructive civil wars in the entire history of ancient Mesopotamia. King Esarhaddon's ambitious blueprint for peace through shared dynastic power was elegant on clay tablets, but it completely underestimated the unyielding currents of personal ambition, imperial friction, and deep-seated national pride. By dividing his vast empire between his two sons Ashurbanipal, who inherited the primary imperial seat of Assyria, and Shamash-shum-ukin, who was installed upon the absolute throne of Babylon, the late monarch had hoped to permanently balance northern military supremacy with southern cultural sensitivity. In theory, this arrangement granted Babylon the dignity of its own resident sovereign, while securing the overarching unity of the realm. In practice, however, this divided inheritance introduced a catastrophic structural flaw that would plunge Mesopotamia into one of the most brutal, destructive civil wars in ancient history. Ashurbanipal succeeded his father in the northern capital of Nineveh in the early decades of the 7th century before the Common Era. He quickly proved himself to be an exceptionally energetic, highly intelligent, and relentlessly ruthless military commander, a master of administrative organization, psychological warfare, and intelligence gathering. Ashurbanipal maintained tight command over the empire's borders through a vast network of imperial spies and frontier garrisons. Under his iron rule, Assyria remained the undisputed military titan of the ancient Near East. Concurrently, his older brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, assumed the absolute crown of Babylon. Having spent years embedded within the cultural and religious traditions of the south, the new Babylonian king was expected to bridge the volatile gap between the two nations. For the first 15 years of his reign, Shamash-shum-ukin governed in relative stability. He meticulously participated in the local religious rituals, respected the complex statutory precedents of Babylonian civil law, and supervised the ongoing physical reconstruction of the metropolis. Yet, beneath this polished facade of shared fraternal rule, an explosive political friction was rapidly expanding. Despite his grand royal title and majestic palace, Shamash-shum-ukin held very little real executive or military power. His younger brother, Ashurbanipal, retained absolute control over the empire's elite standing armies, its foreign diplomacy, and its primary fiscal administration. Babylonian provincial resources and agricultural grain surpluses were continuously extracted to fund costly Assyrian military expeditions on distant frontiers, while native Babylonian nobles remained strictly subordinate to high-ranking Assyrian oversight officials. The appearance of southern autonomy masked a humiliating, continuing structural dependency that deeply alienated the local population. Tensions deepened catastrophically as Ashurbanipal began to bypass his brother's authority, directly intervening in the political affairs of southern Babylonia, a region traditionally tied to the independent Chaldean and Aramean tribal confederations. The patriotic Babylonian elite, the wealthy merchant guilds, and the powerful traditional priesthood of Marduk began to actively question whether their resident king was a genuine sovereign or merely an impotent northern puppet. For Shamash-shum-ukin himself, the deep psychological humiliation of being permanently overshadowed and monitored by his younger brother was compounded by the stark realization that his kingdom would never be truly free under the shadow of Nineveh. By the middle of the 7th century before the Common Era, Shamash-shum-ukin resolved to shatter this structural cage. He began to systematically organize a massive, highly secretive, anti-Assyrian revolutionary coalition, utilizing underground diplomatic networks to unite Assyria's most formidable regional enemies. He forged a deep, clandestine military alignment with the Kingdom of Elam to the east, securing promises of heavy cavalry support and financial capital. Simultaneously, he successfully mobilized the fierce Aramean and Chaldean tribal chieftains of the southern marshlands, effectively reviving the unyielding spirit of resistance that had fueled earlier national uprisings. The Grand Rebellion exploded with terrifying velocity around the year 652 before the Common Era. Babylon and its diverse regional allies rose up in simultaneous, violent revolt, expelling Assyrian monitoring garrisons and declaring absolute national independence. For Shamash-shum-ukin, this was no longer merely a domestic power struggle. It was an all-out, apocalyptic war for the definitive liberation of Babylonia and the permanent dethronement of a brother he viewed as a tyrannical usurper. The scale of the uprising shook the Neo-Assyrian Empire to its absolute foundations, forcing Ashurbanipal to mobilize the entire kinetic weight of his professional military machine to crush the southern threat. Ashurbanipal responded with a swift, calculated, and overwhelming display of military force. Invoking his divine mandate from the gods of the north, he marched his veteran, armor-clad infantry divisions and heavy war chariots southward into the Mesopotamian plain, systematically isolating Babylon from its international allies. Through a sequence of high-intensity, bloody encounters, Assyrian legions decisively crushed the Elamite relief forces along the eastern border and systematically decimated Chaldean resistance in the southern marshlands, leaving the capital completely cut off, stranded, and surrounded. What followed was one of the most horrific, protracted military sieges in the long history of antiquity. For several grueling years, Ashurbanipal's forces maintained a suffocating, unbreakable blockade around the massive walls of Babylon, systematically cutting off all incoming food supplies, trade commodities, and communication lines. As the siege dragged on relentlessly, the interior of the metropolis descended into a devastating humanitarian disaster. Severe famine, rampant disease, and absolute social breakdown tore through the residential quarters, with ancient records whispering of unimaginable desperation as the civilian populace slowly starved to death behind the stone ramparts. Shamash-Shumukin's revolutionary coalition crumbled into absolute nothingness as outside support vanished beneath the relentless pressure of the Assyrian vanguard. Yet, the defenders of Babylon, driven by a mixture of patriotic willpower and the terrifying knowledge of what Assyrian retribution would entail, stubbornly refused to open their gates. The cataclysmic end arrived around the year 648 before the Common Era, when the broken, disease-ridden city was finally overwhelmed and stormed by Ashurbanipal's veteran troops. The immediate aftermath of the capture was characterized by a cold, systematic slaughter of the remaining rebel leadership. While the exact historical details of Shamash-Shumukin's final moments remain a subject of intense scholarly debate, contemporary Assyrian royal inscriptions claim that the defeated king perished amid the roaring flames of his own grand palace, choosing a violent death by fire over the absolute humiliation of surrender to his younger brother. The material cost to Babylon was immense. Although Ashurbanipal consciously refrained from executing the total physical annihilation that his grandfather Sennacherib had perpetrated decades earlier, the city was thoroughly punished. Its administrative autonomy was completely revoked, its grand temples were looted of their remaining treasures, and its patriotic nobles were systematically executed or driven into permanent exile. Ashurbanipal re-established a suffocating, direct Assyrian imperial oversight, installing fiercely loyal military governors to run the provincial networks and dismantling the very last vestiges of independent Babylonian kingship. Culturally, however, the ancient metropolis remained completely indispensable to the wider Near East. Despite his brutal kinetic suppression of the rebellion, Ashurbanipal maintained an extraordinary, almost reverent respect for Babylon's intellectual and scientific institutions. He famously commanded his scribes and military officers to systematically amass thousands of ancient cuneiform tablets from the local temple libraries and scholarly academies, transporting them directly to his grand royal library at Nineveh. Epic poems, legal codes, mathematical treatises, and astronomical observations were meticulously copied and preserved because of this imperial project, ensuring that Babylon's profound intellectual legacy would survive even as its political ambitions were violently crushed. The tragic rebellion of Shamash-Shumukin marked the definitive end of Babylon's independence during the classical Neo-Assyrian period, transforming the sacred metropolis into a heavily monitored imperial possession rather than a true partner in regional governance. Yet, the unyielding ideals that the fallen brother war had embodied, local autonomy, cultural pride, and divine legitimacy, could never be fully extinguished by Northern iron. They lingered deeply within the collective memory of the southern populace, reinforced by centuries of systematic resistance. Even as foreign Assyrian officials dictated policy from the city's palaces, the people of Babylon quietly waited beneath the shadow of empire for the historic dawn of a new leader who would finally lead them to absolute vengeance. In the decades following the brutal suppression of Shamash-Shumukin's rebellion, the Neo-Assyrian Empire appeared to stand at the absolute pinnacle of its global dominance. Its sovereign shadow stretched from the high mountains of Iran to the rich coastlines of the Mediterranean Sea, its central garrisons brutally monitoring every major urban center across the Fertile Crescent. Yet, beneath this massive, polished facade of absolute imperial invincibility, the internal structural foundations of the Northern Titan were rapidly cracking. The immense financial and human costs of sustaining constant, multi-front military campaigns, combined with a growing domestic resentment among millions of subjugated peoples, had thoroughly exhausted the empire's core resources. In the Deep South, amid these spreading systemic fractures, Babylon was quietly preparing to launch its final, cataclysmic strike for absolute liberation under the leadership of a brilliant Chaldean general named Nabopolassar. The long-awaited strategic turning point arrived during the closing years of the 7th century before the Common Era, triggered by a profound, chaotic succession crisis within Assyria itself. Following the death of King Ashurbanipal, who had long maintained an iron grip over his vast domains through an advanced domestic intelligence network, the northern capital of Nineveh was suddenly paralyzed by a sequence of weak, short-lived rulers and violent dynastic civil wars. As the centralized administrative apparatus of Assyria turned inward to wage war against its own court factions, its defensive grip over the distant frontier provinces dissolved overnight. It was precisely within this volatile power vacuum that local revolutionary leaders across Mesopotamia recognized an unprecedented, historic opportunity to permanently shatter the northern yoke. Among these rising frontline commanders, Nabopolassar emerged as a master of both tactical military warfare and high-stakes political statecraft. Originally a highly capable Chaldean general who had likely risen through the ranks of the provincial administration or served within the local military networks of southern Babylonia, Nabopolassar possessed a profound personal charisma and an unyielding strategic vision. He successfully mobilized the deep-seated, multi-century hatred that native Babylonians harbored toward their northern oppressors, unifying the traditional urban priesthood, the wealthy merchant classes, and the fierce, heavily armed Chaldean tribal confederations into a singular, cohesive national movement. In the momentous year of 626 before the Common Era, he officially marched into the capital and declared himself the absolute king of Babylon, initiating a glorious new imperial line known to history as the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. The newly installed Assyrian monarch, Sin-Shar-ishkun, recognized that the loss of Babylon represented an existential threat to his crown, and he rapidly mobilized his remaining veteran divisions to launch a sequence of high-intensity punitive campaigns aimed at recapturing the southern metropolis. However, Nabopolassar proved to be an exceptionally brilliant defensive strategist, skillfully utilizing the complex physical geography of southern Mesopotamia to his absolute advantage. His forces transformed the vast network of deep Babylonian irrigation canals, flooded river plains, and narrow marsh passes into an impenetrable shield, systematically outmaneuvering and decimating the advancing Assyrian columns far from their logistics bases. As Nabopolassar held firm in the south, a magnificent and completely unprecedented geopolitical alignment materialized along the northern horizons. The Medes, an Indo-Iranian people who had built a powerful, heavily militarized state on the Iranian plateau under the iron-willed command of King Cyaxares, launched their own massive offensive against the decaying Assyrian frontiers. Recognizing that they shared an absolute strategic interest in the total annihilation of the northern Titan, Nabopolassar and Cyaxares skillfully forged a grand military alliance. This historic Babylonian Median coalition combined overwhelming kinetic cavalry strength, advanced siege technologies, and a shared, remorseless determination to permanently erase Assyria from the map of the world. The joint campaign that followed was characterized by a rapid, devastating momentum that systematically dismantled centuries of northern power. Beginning in the mid-620s before the Common Era, the Allied armies pushed aggressively into the Assyrian heartland, methodically besieging, storming, and flattening key historical strongholds along the Tigris River. Cities that had long functioned as the proud centers of imperial administration, such as Assur, Tarbisu, and Kala, were brutally overrun and stripped of their immense stolen wealth. By the summer of 612 before the Common Era, the combined legions of Babylon and Media finally arrived before the massive, double-layered stone ramparts of Nineveh itself, the supreme capital of the empire. The subsequent siege of Nineveh was an extraordinarily high-stakes, brutal exercise in coordinate engineering and assault warfare. For 3 grueling months, the Allied forces maintained a suffocating blockade around the metropolis, while heavily utilizing advanced battering rams and diverted river waters to slowly undermine the city's ancient stone masonry. When a critical sector of the wall finally collapsed, the Babylonian and Median vanguard surged through the breach, unleashing a remorseless, systematic sack of the entire capital. The magnificent royal palaces, the grand temples, and the extensive cuneiform archives that had dictated the destiny of the Near East for generations were thoroughly plundered, dismantled, and consumed by fire. King Sin-shar-ish-kun perished amid the chaotic slaughter of his defensive lines, and the greatest metropolis of the northern world was permanently reduced to a desolate heap of smoking ash and rubble. The total fall of Nineveh effectively shattered the central administrative core of the Assyrian state. But the remaining remnants of the northern military elite managed to execute a desperate retreat westward, establishing a temporary seat of power at the strategic city of Haran. Refusing to allow their ancient oppressor any structural respiration, Nabopolassar and his Median allies pursued the fleeing enemy with an unyielding velocity. In the year 600 and 609, before the Common Era, the coalition forces successfully stormed Haran, permanently extinguishing the last formal remnants of Assyrian political administration from global history. The final, desperate stand of the northern forces materialized along the upper Euphrates corridor, bolstered by a massive military intervention from the new kingdom of Egypt. The Egyptian pharaohs, terrified by the rapid, unchecked expansion of a revitalized Babylon, had boldly marched their armies northward to act as a geopolitical buffer and preserve a weak Assyrian remnant. But the historic momentum of the Neo-Babylonian war machine was completely unstoppable. Through a sequence of high-intensity, bloody encounters in northern Syria, Nabopolassar's legions utterly routed the combined Egyptian-Assyrian vanguard, permanently ending centuries of northern military resistance. Through this spectacular, total victory, Nabopolassar accomplished what generations of independent Babylonian chieftains and revolutionary kings had failed to do. He had not only restored absolute national sovereignty to his people, but had completely destroyed the most terrifying empire of antiquity. His triumph represented a complete, historic reversal of fortunes, transforming Babylon out of its long winter of forced vassalage and rebirth into the supreme, undisputed center of a magnificent new global empire. Following the conclusion of these campaigns, Nabopolassar returned to his capital to focus his immense administrative energy on internal reconstruction, professionalizing the state treasuries, and systematically rebuilding the civic infrastructure damaged across decades of conflict. The traditional priesthood was fully restored to its historical privileges, and the cult of Marduk was re-established with unparalleled splendor. Most remarkably, as his long reign drew to a close, Nabopolassar oversaw a completely smooth, peaceful transfer of executive command to his brilliant eldest son, Nebuchadnezzar II. This rare display of dynastic unity ensured that the new empire, born in the crucible of absolute global revolution, was perfectly positioned to step into its golden classical zenith. When Nebuchadnezzar II ascended the absolute throne of Babylon in the early 6th century before the Common Era, he inherited a revitalized kingdom forged through the sweeping military triumphs and internal structural restorations of his father, Nabopolassar. But while his predecessor had laid the definitive groundwork for Babylon's independence and historical vengeance against the north, it would be Nebuchadnezzar who systematically transformed the state into the beating heart of a powerful, magnificent, and highly ambitious global empire. Under his long, eventful reign, Babylon reached the absolute zenith of its territorial power, architectural grandeur, and cultural influence, transforming into the ultimate, defining symbol of Mesopotamian civilization across both contemporary and later global memory. Nebuchadnezzar II began his imperial reign shortly after participating directly as a frontline commander in the high-intensity campaigns that concluded the final chapters of Assyrian military resistance. He possessed an extraordinary strategic intellect, an unyielding imperial will, and a deep, lifelong commitment to the glorification of his capital. One of his very first acts as absolute monarch was the aggressive continuation of military operations across the western horizons, particularly throughout the regions of Syria and the Levant. These massive campaigns were engineered to consolidate Babylon's permanent influence over former Assyrian territories, dismantle local resistance movements, and secure absolute control over the vital, highly lucrative trade routes that linked the Mesopotamian plains with the Mediterranean coast. The military genius of Nebuchadnezzar was evident from the outset of his independent campaigns. He rapidly brought rebellious provincial city-states under tight administrative control, utilizing his highly trained, armor-clad infantry divisions and mobile cavalry forces to project an overwhelming kinetic presence. His conquests included extensive territories across modern-day Lebanon, northern Syria, Israel, and the highly contested frontier zones of the Egyptian border. The Neo-Babylonian army, supported by a sophisticated logistical network and advanced siege engineering units, became an unstoppable force of imperial dictation across the Near East. Among the most consequential and historically celebrated of Nebuchadnezzar's Western campaigns was his protracted, high-stakes confrontation with the Kingdom of Judah. Caught in a volatile geopolitical vice between the fading military power of Egypt and the relentless westward expansion of Babylon, the rulers of Judah vacillated dangerously in their strategic loyalties, an indecision that would ultimately prove to be structurally disastrous for their nation. Following several failed domestic revolts and repeated defiance of Babylonian imperial treaties by consecutive Judean kings, Nebuchadnezzar launched a full-scale, devastating punitive campaign against the city of Jerusalem. The historic city of Jerusalem was subjected to a suffocating, multi-year military siege, and after years of fanatical local resistance, its defenses were completely shattered and overrun by Babylonian troops. Nebuchadnezzar ordered the systematic destruction of the Temple of Solomon, the most sacred site in Judahite religion, and commanded the thorough plunder of its structural wealth. Most crucially, he executed a massive, state-directed relocation policy, carrying away many of the country's inhabitants, particularly the elite classes, the royal family, the craftsmen, and the traditional priesthood, into a prolonged captivity within the heart of Mesopotamia. This historic event, recognized across global religious and historical literature as the Babylonian exile, marked a defining, foundational trauma in Jewish history. From a Babylonian administrative point of view, however, this mass deportation was part of a broader, highly rationalized imperial strategy. By systematically shifting conquered populations away from their ancestral power bases and integrating them directly into the imperial center, Nebuchadnezzar successfully weakened regional nationalistic resistance, while simultaneously strengthening the economic and administrative reach of his capital. The exiles were frequently employed as highly skilled laborers, agrarian administrators, and temple servants, contributing heavily to the expanding infrastructure of the state. Domestically, Nebuchadnezzar devoted vast, unprecedented resources from his imperial conquests to the total physical and architectural transformation of Babylon itself. The city became one of the largest, most technologically advanced, and visually stunning metropolises in the ancient world, meticulously designed to manifest the rising majesty of the state and its chief deity, Marduk. One of the most renowned and breathtaking constructions of his reign was the monumental Ishtar Gate, the grand inner entrance to the capital. Decorated with rows of brilliant, deep blue glazed bricks depicting finely crafted lions, dragons, and bulls, representing the various gods of the Babylonian pantheon, the gate served as an awe-inspiring statement of imperial power. The Ishtar Gate opened directly into a grand, stone-paved, processional way that led through the heart of the capital to the Esagila temple complex, the central religious and civic sanctuary of Marduk. These monumental public works were not merely aesthetic additions, they served a vital political and ideological purpose, demonstrating the absolute wealth of the crown, the unyielding stability of the regime, and the close partnership between the earthly monarch and the divine realm. To protect this immense grandeur, Nebuchadnezzar undertook the complete restoration and expansion of Babylon's defensive fortification walls, creating a triple-layered network of masonry so wide that contemporary historians claimed heavy war chariots could pass one another atop the ramparts without conflict. He also constructed massive new canals, advanced irrigation systems, and extensive state granaries to permanently secure food supplies for the rapidly growing urban population. Perhaps the most enduring legend tied to the name of Nebuchadnezzar II is the construction of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, celebrated across classical history as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. According to later Greek historians, the king commanded his architects to build a colossal, multi-layered artificial mountain of terraces filled with exotic trees, flowing mountain streams, and vibrant flora to please his Median or Persian wife, who missed the green, forested hills of her northern homeland. While the physical existence of the gardens at the Babylon site has not been definitively confirmed by modern archaeological science, the legend itself beautifully reflects the immense grandeur, technological sophistication, and limitless ambition associated with his long reign, symbolizing a monarch capable of bending nature itself to imperial aesthetics. Throughout his 4 decades of absolute rule, Nebuchadnezzar maintained an exceptionally close, supportive relationship with the traditional priesthood and temple institutions. He funded lavish religious festivals, most notably the annual Akitu New Year celebration, and made regular, massive offerings of silver, gold, and livestock to ensure the continuous favor of the gods. Culturally, the Neo-Babylonian period under his leadership witnessed a magnificent flowering of literature, scribal scholarship, and scientific codification. Scribes and astronomers carefully mapped the movements of the stars, recorded complex celestial omens, and administered the vast bureaucracy with remarkable mathematical precision. Nebuchadnezzar passed away peacefully after a long, stable reign, leaving behind an empire at its absolute geographical and political peak, having etched his name permanently into the stone and memory of global history. By the time of King Nebuchadnezzar II's long and prosperous reign, Babylon was not merely the capital of a vast territorial empire. It had risen to become the largest, wealthiest, and most technologically advanced metropolis in the known world. Its physical and intellectual shadow reached far beyond the immediate banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, projecting a powerful presence across the ancient Near East, not only through the overwhelming force of its army, but also through its immense cultural, scientific, and religious achievements. To fully comprehend Babylon during this legendary golden age, one must look past the towering blue facades of its gates and temples to examine the daily rhythms of its streets, the sophisticated practices of its scholarly elites, and the intricate social structures that animated its diverse population. At the absolute foundation of daily Babylonian life stood an extraordinarily complex, deeply institutionalized religious network. The Babylonians lived in a universe where every natural force, political event, and personal fortune was directly dictated by a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses who demanded continuous ritual maintenance. While Marduk, the chief deity of the capital, held supreme cosmological authority as the king of the universe, he operated alongside a brilliant assembly of historical Mesopotamian divinities. The people paid intense devotion to Ishtar, the volatile goddess of love, fertility, and strategic warfare, to Nabu, the patron lord of wisdom, literacy, and scribal arts, to Shamash, the bringer of the sun and universal justice, and to Ea, the ancient god of fresh, subterranean waters and deep occult knowledge. The massive temple sanctuaries dedicated to these various deities were far more than simple houses of worship. They functioned as the dominant economic hubs, administrative centers, and educational institutions of the entire empire. The majestic Esagila temple complex of Marduk stood as the absolute center of Babylon's civic and economic life, managing thousands of acres of fertile agricultural land, maintaining its own private commercial fleets, and employing an extensive hierarchy of priests, administrative scribes, and temple laborers. The priests were not merely spiritual intermediaries. They represented a highly educated, wealthy, aristocratic class, responsible for monitoring royal properties, administering civil legal oaths, and preserving centuries of sacred knowledge. This advanced education was rigorously conducted within specialized scribal academies and temple libraries, where scholars achieved a magnificent standard of empirical precision, most notably in the fields of divination, mathematics, and astronomy. The Babylonians operated under the deep-seated conviction that the gods continuously communicated their future intentions to humanity through subtle natural omens, particularly the movements of celestial bodies. Consequently, astronomers who belonged to the high-ranking priestly orders spent centuries carefully mapping the night skies, systematically recording the exact positions of the moon, the planets, and the constellations on detailed clay tablets. Through this continuous empirical observation, Babylonian scholars developed a remarkably sophisticated mathematical system based on the number 60, which allowed them to track lunar cycles, predict solar eclipses, and map planetary motion with an accuracy that stunned later classical civilizations. Vast cuneiform omen series, such as the Enuma Anu Enlil, meticulously connected these specific astronomical phenomena with political outcomes, agrarian harvests, and imperial fortunes, laying the absolute historical foundations for modern empirical forecasting and astronomy across subsequent generations. Babylon was, above all else, a city of writing. Cuneiform, the complex wedge-shaped script, originally engineered by the Sumerians, remained the primary medium for state administration, international diplomacy, economic contracts, and high literature. Scribes spent decades training within specialized schools, known as Dubba, or tablet houses, where they systematically mastered thousands of characters, learned classical Sumerian alongside contemporary Akkadian, and copied the great literary epics of the past. The royal and temple libraries of Babylon preserved definitive, standardized editions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation myth, and intricate legal codes, treating the physical act of textual copying as a sacred participation in the transmission of divine and human wisdom. In the crowded streets beneath the temples, Babylon functioned as a bustling, multi-ethnic, cosmopolitan center filled with a fluid movement of international traders, skilled craftsmen, market merchants, state officials, and common laborers. The metropolis was meticulously organized into distinct residential quarters, many of which were directly associated with specific temple networks or professional merchant guilds. The open-air city markets offered an unparalleled wealth of global commodities, where local agricultural surpluses of grain, dates, and sesame oil were continuously exchanged for fine timber from the forests of Lebanon, raw copper from the Persian Gulf, aromatic spices from Arabia, and silver from the mountain networks of Anatolia. The social fabric of Babylonian society during this golden age was highly hierarchical but fundamentally fluid. At the absolute apex stood the royal family and high bureaucratic officials, followed closely by the wealthy priesthood and aristocratic landowners. Merchants and international traders enjoyed a remarkable degree of legal and economic autonomy, managing extensive commercial ventures with minimal state interference. Below them sat the vast populace of common scribes, artisans, and agrarian laborers. At the absolute bottom of the social ladder were the slaves, many of whom had been captured during Nebuchadnezzar's western campaigns or born into domestic servitude due to familial debt obligations. However, Babylonian slavery was not characterized by absolute, unalterable subjection. Under current civil legal codes, slaves retained the right to own private property, conduct independent businesses, act as legal witnesses in court, and even purchase their own formal manumission. Women across Babylonian society also possessed varied, highly complex roles, depending on their socio-economic background. While elite women frequently managed large agricultural estates, engaged in international trade contracts, or served as highly visible priestesses within the sanctuaries, common women were actively employed within industrial textile production, food preservation, and local market commerce. Legal tablets from the era prove that women could independently inherit property, initiate formal divorce proceedings, and participate directly in civil contracts. Although their structural rights remained considerably more constrained than those of men, family life functioned as the absolute center of Babylonian culture, with multi-generational households serving as the primary socio-economic unit of the state. Marriages were meticulously treated as legal and economic arrangements between families, formalized through explicit written contracts that detailed dowries, bride prices, and the respective liabilities of both parties. Children were raised with an unyielding mandate to honor their parents and preserve the family's public reputation, which carried immense weight within local judicial proceedings. Babylonian law, adapting the ancient principles of Hammurabi's classical code to the economic realities of the 6th century, was administered by professional state judges in public forums, ensuring a remarkable standard of predictability for contracts, inheritance claims, and property lines. This advanced civic society was supported by a magnificent infrastructure of deep irrigation canals, grand paved stone roads, and state-of-the-art public works that ensured the metropolis could comfortably manage seasonal floods and sustain a massive urban population. The collective identity of this diverse populace was periodically reinforced through spectacular religious festivals that brought the entire city together in acts of shared political and spiritual devotion. The most critical of these events was the annual Akitu New Year Festival, a high-stakes, multi-day ritual that symbolized the cosmic renewal of the universe and the divine validation of the king's authority. The Akitu involved magnificent public processions along the processional way, the ritual humiliation and subsequent restoration of the monarch before the physical statue of Marduk, and dramatic theatrical reenactments of mythological battles against primordial chaos. These grand festivals successfully reinforced social bonds, affirmed the absolute legitimacy of the Neo-Babylonian crown, and deeply reconnected the human community with its divine protectors. Life in Babylon during this classical zenith was undoubtedly layered with inequality and the strains of imperial extraction, but it stood as a magnificent marvel of human achievement, an absolute beacon of ancient science, art, and administration, whose sophisticated rhythms would echo across global memory for millennia. Following the remarkable achievements of Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon entered a profound period of political transition. The city remained immensely prosperous, culturally vibrant, and administratively functional, but its internal political stability began to erode at an alarming pace. The final decades of the Neo-Babylonian Empire were heavily marked by intense court intrigue, administrative volatility, and widening discontent among key domestic factions. At the absolute heart of this turbulent period stood a king whose reign was both highly unconventional and deeply divisive, Nabonidus. His rule would ultimately culminate in the dramatic and largely peaceful conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great, marking the definitive end of independent Babylonian political history. Nabonidus came to the absolute throne of Babylon in the mid-6th century, before the Common Era, under circumstances that remain highly complex and historically debated. He was not a member of the established royal lineage of Nebuchadnezzar, and his sudden rise to supreme power may have involved intricate court maneuvering, military backing, or factional support from outside the traditional Babylonian aristocratic elite. What is clearly known from contemporary cuneiform records is that Nabonidus was an eccentric scholar king, deeply religious, and unusually devoted to the moon god Sin, whose principal ancient cult centers were located far from the capital in the historical cities of Haran and Ur. From the absolute outset of his reign, Nabonidus's radical religious policies caused severe internal structural tension across the state. The Babylonian religious and political establishment had for centuries centered entirely on the supreme worship of Marduk, and the earthly king's authority was strictly defined through meticulous rituals associated with Marduk's grand temple, the Esagila, especially during the annual Akitu New Year Festival. Nabonidus, however, demonstrated a clear, uncompromising preference for Sin, systematically commissioning grand temples in his honor, elevating his status to the absolute apex of the state pantheon, and shifting royal devotion away from traditional Babylonian deities. While the king's personal piety was entirely genuine, it deeply alienated the powerful, wealthy, traditional priesthood of Marduk and severely disrupted the established religious hierarchy of the capital. The most controversial and unprecedented episode of Nabonidus's reign occurred when he chose to physically abandon Babylon for a prolonged period, a shocking act that threw the administrative and spiritual core of the empire into complete disarray. Around the 10th year of his rule, the king completely withdrew from the capital and relocated to the remote oasis city of Tama in northwestern Arabia, where he remained in voluntary exile for approximately a decade. The strategic and personal reasons behind this extraordinary move remain a subject of intense historical debate, with some scholars suggesting it was driven by a deep religious retreat linked to his veneration of sin, while others argue it was a highly calculated political and military attempt to secure lucrative trade routes across the Arabian Peninsula. During his decade-long absence from the capital, Nabonidus left his ambitious son, Belshazzar, in executive charge of Babylon's domestic affairs. Belshazzar appears extensively throughout various contemporary administrative documents and legal ledgers, managing the daily bureaucracy and maintaining public security. He is also famously known within later biblical tradition as the co-regent and ruler present during the city's dramatic final hours. However, Belshazzar was never formally crowned as the absolute monarch and lacked the full religious authority required of a true Babylonian king, leading to a prolonged period of unclear, fragmented leadership that severely weakened the psychological stability of the state. This fractured dual structure of absentee kingship and delegated authority proved to be structurally problematic for the empire. Within the Mesopotamian worldview, the complex rituals of statecraft required the physical, active presence of the monarch within the capital, particularly during the high-stakes annual Akitu festival. Without the king to physically grasp the hands of the statue of Marduk, the symbolic renewal of order between the gods, the populace, and the state could not be performed, causing the festival to be cancelled year after year. As the winter seasons passed without the performance of these sacred rites, widespread frustration, economic strain, and a sense of divine abandonment grew rapidly among the clergy, the nobility, and ordinary citizens alike. Meanwhile, beyond the empire's vulnerable eastern borders, a spectacular new global superpower was rapidly gathering strength. In the highlands of Iran, the brilliant Persian ruler Cyrus the Great had successfully united the tribes of the Iranian plateau, overthrown the Median line, and begun aggressively expanding his domain across the Near East. Cyrus's military campaigns were swift, strategic, and remarkably effective, moving with an unprecedented kinetic momentum that overwhelmed traditional regional defenses. More importantly, Cyrus built an international reputation not merely as a remorseless conqueror, but as an enlightened liberator and pragmatic reformer, systematically offering cultural tolerance to conquered peoples and working in close partnership with local elites rather than dismantling their institutions. As the Persian vanguard approached Babylonian territory, Cyrus found a population that was deeply divided, spiritually exhausted, and in many cases, thoroughly disillusioned with their absentee monarch. Nabonidus's radical religious reforms had permanently shattered his domestic legitimacy. His long absence had undermined his administrative authority, and the economic management of the realm had faltered significantly, with temple financial ledgers showing severe strain and provincial local governors acting with growing indifference toward the crown. By the time Nabonidus finally returned to Babylon to prepare his defenses, the internal political cohesion of the Neo-Babylonian Empire had completely frayed, leaving the magnificent crossroads of civilization stranded on the threshold of its ultimate reckoning. By the year 539 before the Common Era, the structural vulnerabilities rotting the foundations of the Neo-Babylonian Empire had rendered the magnificent state entirely fragile. Cyrus the Great, operating with a profound strategic intellect, recognized that to capture the wealthiest crossroads of antiquity, he did not need to engage in a protracted war of attrition that would reduce Babylon's valuable economic infrastructure to ash. Instead, he implemented a masterfully engineered campaign that paired precise tactical military pressure with high-stakes psychological warfare and proactive underground diplomacy, directly exploiting the deep religious fractures that King Nabonidus had opened within his own capital. As the Persian legions began their westward advance, Cyrus systematically dispatched secret envoys and high-level diplomats into the heart of Babylon. These agents successfully infiltrated the upper echelons of the Babylonian administrative networks, establishing direct communication lines with disaffected aristocratic families, wealthy merchant guilds, and, most crucially, the powerful traditional priesthood of Marduk. To these elite groups, who felt their social privileges and spiritual identity had been permanently violated by Nabonidus's devotion to the moon god, Cyrus offered an exceptionally brilliant political covenant. He promised that under Persian imperial monitoring, the ancient status of Marduk would be instantly restored, temple properties would be legally protected, and the traditional religious calendar would resume without palace interference. The actual military collision began along the northern borderlands of Babylonia, where Nabonidus had mobilized his remaining central standing forces to check the Persian vanguard. In the early autumn of 539 before the Common Era, the two grand armies collided near the strategic river town of Opis along the banks of the Tigris. The ensuing Battle of Opis was a swift and catastrophic destruction for the Babylonian lines. Cyrus's highly disciplined, mobile cavalry units and specialized archers completely outmaneuvered Nabonidus's forces, shattering their defensive perimeter and causing widespread panic across the provincial networks. Nabonidus fled the field in absolute dismay, retreating toward the capital in a desperate attempt to organize a final stand behind Babylon's massive triple-layered fortification walls. However, the internal political cohesion of the city had completely dissolved. Recognizing that further resistance would only invite a brutal siege, the high-ranking clergy and municipal leaders decided to execute a bloodless transfer of sovereign command. When the elite Persian vanguard, under the tactical command of the general Ugbaru, arrived before the capital, the massive blue gates of Babylon were boldly thrown open from within. On the 12th of October, Persian troops marched quietly into the heart of the metropolis without encountering any armed resistance. The city fell not through the violence of battering rams, devastating fires, or starvation, but through a structured, negotiated surrender, marking one of the most extraordinary and peaceful conquests in the long history of global empires. Cyrus the Great made his magnificent, formal entry into the conquered capital a few weeks later, executing a masterclass in political stagecraft and imperial public relations. He did not enter as a ruthless, foreign conqueror intent on plundering the wealth of the state. Instead, he presented himself as a pious, divinely chosen liberator who had come to rescue the holy metropolis from the tyrannical eccentricities of an illegitimate king. To permanently cement this narrative within global memory, the new monarch commissioned the creation of the famous Cyrus Cylinder, a monumental clay declaration inscribed in traditional Babylonian cuneiform and placed beneath the foundations of the Esagila temple. Within this historic text, Cyrus skillfully adopted the traditional vocabulary of Mesopotamian kingship, declaring that the supreme deity, Marduk, had scanned all lands looking for a just ruler and had personally grasped Cyrus's hand, calling him to become the absolute master of the world. The text meticulously contrasts the impiety of Nabonidus, who had neglected the traditional sacrifices and caused the cancellation of the Akitu festival, with the profound righteousness of Cyrus, who ordered his soldiers to maintain absolute public order, forbid any plundering, and daily honor the local sanctuaries. Displaying a rare standard of strategic magnanimity, Cyrus permitted all foreign populations who had been forcefully relocated by previous Babylonian kings, including the exiled Jewish community from Jerusalem, to freely return to their ancestral homelands and rebuild their holy temples, earning him permanent praise across multiple global cultural traditions. The captured King Nabonidus was treated with considerable political dignity, stripped of his crown but spared from execution, and permanently exiled to the peaceful region of Carmania in southern Iran, where he spent his final years away from the geopolitical stage. His ambitious son, Belshazzar, who had attempted to maintain a brief resistance within the royal palace sectors, disappeared entirely from the historical record during the initial transfer of power his line completely extinguished. Cyrus allowed Babylon's extensive administrative bureaucracy, its complex civil legal courts, and its traditional municipal frameworks to continue functioning with minimal disruption, seamlessly integrating the ancient kingdom into the expanding architecture of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. For the proud population of Babylon, this total transition represented both a tragic end and a highly stable beginning. Politically, the illustrious Neo-Babylonian dynasty was permanently finished, and the city would never again serve as the sovereign capital of an independent Mesopotamian state. Yet, under the protective shadow of the Persian crown, Babylon retained its status as the supreme commercial, intellectual, and spiritual heart of the Near East. The priests of Marduk regained their immense institutional influence. Traditional festivals were celebrated with unprecedented royal funding, and the ancient scribal academies continued to produce sophisticated mathematical and astronomical records well into the subsequent centuries, proving that while independent political power is temporary, the enduring achievements of a resilient culture can outlive the fall of its thrones. The formal integration of Babylonia into the vast transcontinental architecture of the Achaemenid Persian Empire marked the definitive end of its independent political history, yet it simultaneously initiated a magnificent and highly influential chapter in the city's historical afterlife. While Babylon had permanently surrendered its status as the sovereign capital of its own native kings, it refused to dissolve into a mere provincial backwater. Instead, under the pragmatic governance of Cyrus the Great and his Sargonid-like Persian successors, the ancient metropolis systematically refashioned itself into a primary administrative center, a wealthy imperial residence, and the undisputed intellectual and spiritual heart of the Achaemenid world. The early Persian monarchs demonstrated an extraordinary standard of strategic statecraft, choosing to preserve and utilize Babylon's highly efficient bureaucratic infrastructure rather than dismantling it. They officially designated Babylonia as a supreme imperial satrapy, placing the fertile river plains under the executive monitoring of royal Persian satraps who governed in close partnership with the native traditional elites. The extensive cuneiform archives surviving from this transitional era reveal that the central state administration, the complex civil legal courts, and the grand temple economies continued to operate with a remarkable degree of institutional continuity. Babylonian scribes, rigorously trained within the traditional tablet houses, remained entirely indispensable to the Persian crown. They continuously drafted official state documents, managed regional tax networks, and recorded commercial transactions, utilizing Old Babylonian Akkadian, which stood alongside Old Persian and Elamite as an official language of the Achaemenid imperial administration. The wealthy merchant guilds and banking families of the capital, most notably the illustrious House of Agibi, aggressively expanded their commercial operations under the protection of the Persian peace, managing vast transnational networks of trade, real estate, and financial credit that stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean coast. Concurrently, the traditional priesthood of Marduk regained its immense institutional wealth and social privileges, which had been dangerously compromised during the eccentric reign of Nabonidus. The early Persian kings, fulfilling the solemn covenants etched upon the Cyrus cylinder, provided massive royal subsidies to ensure the continuous physical maintenance of the Esagila temple complex and its towering ziggurat, the Etemenanki. The sacred rituals, daily sacrifices, and the grand seasonal pageants were celebrated with unparalleled splendor, transforming Babylon into a highly visible sanctuary where the Persian monarchs periodically resided to ritually validate their universal sovereignty as the legitimate kings of Babylon. It was during this long winter of foreign imperial stability that Babylon's legendary scientific, mathematical, and astronomical traditions reached an extraordinary classical peak. Within the quiet observation towers of the city's temples, scholarly priestly elites spent centuries carefully mapping the night skies with an unprecedented empirical precision. Undeterred by the shifting of political thrones, these astronomers systematically compiled detailed planetary tables, recorded exact solar and lunar eclipses, and created highly advanced mathematical models to track the complex movements of Venus, Jupiter, and Mars. The empirical breakthroughs achieved by these Babylonian scholars during the Achaemenid and subsequent Hellenistic eras, including the division of the sky into the 12 equal signs of the zodiac, and the development of the sexagesimal numerical system filtered directly westward into the Mediterranean world, laying the absolute historical foundations for Greek, Islamic, and modern European mathematical astronomy across global history. However, this stable accommodation between the native populace and the Persian crown was periodically fractured by explosive undercurrents of Babylonian patriotism. Despite the relative material prosperity and cultural autonomy guaranteed by the Achaemenid kings, significant factions within the native nobility and the priesthood fiercely resented their ultimate subordination to a foreign Iranian elite. Whenever the Persian imperial center suffered from sudden dynastic succession crises or military exhaustion on distant frontiers, ambitious native charismatic leaders would boldly raise the banner of open rebellion, attempting to violently resurrect the independent sovereign line of Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar. During the late 6th and early 5th centuries before the Common Era, major anti-Persian national uprisings exploded across Babylonia, with local revolutionary claimants such as Nidintu Bel and Arukha, who both adopted the highly symbolic royal name of Nebuchadnezzar, successfully seizing control of the capital and declaring absolute independence. These rebellions were met with a swift, calculated, and overwhelming display of kinetic violence from the iron-willed Persian monarch Darius the Great, who marched his elite standing divisions into the river plains to brutally crush the rebel lines, execute the ringleaders, and systematically reinforce Achaemenid direct rule. Tensions reached an even more destructive climax under the reign of Xerxes I, who responded to a renewed southern uprising by ruthlessly punishing the capital, stripping Babylon of its special independent status, and, according to certain classical historical accounts, severely damaging sections of its religious sanctuaries to permanently break the political influence of the traditional priesthood. The geopolitical tapestry of the region was transformed once again in the late 4th century, before the Common Era, when the unstoppable military machine of Alexander the Great swept across the Near East, decisively shattering Achaemenid Persian power. Alexander possessed a profound, almost reverent fascination with the immense grandeur and antiquity of Babylon, recognizing it as the absolute strategic crossroads of the civilized world. Following his total victory at the Battle of Gaugamela, the young Macedonian conqueror entered the city gates in grand triumph, immediately commanding his army to respect the local sanctuaries and ordering the comprehensive architectural restoration of the Esagila temple, which had fallen into partial disrepair. Alexander envisioned Babylon not as a distant satrapy of a European kingdom, but as the supreme, magnificent capital of his newly consolidated global empire, a cosmopolitan center where the intellectual learning of Mesopotamia could merge with the artistic and scientific traditions of the Hellenic world. It was within the grand mud-brick pavilions of Nebuchadnezzar's royal palace that Alexander the Great spent his final days, planning massive new naval expeditions into Arabia and the Mediterranean before succumbing to a sudden, fatal illness. In the summer of 323, before the Common Era, his world-shattering life freezing permanently into legend within the heart of Babylon. In the chaotic, multi-generational succession wars that erupted among Alexander's generals following his sudden death, the Seleucid dynasty successfully secured control over Mesopotamia. The ambitious Seleucid monarchs, driven by an intense desire to establish their own Hellenistic identity and centralize their administrative apparatus, made a fateful geopolitical decision that would permanently seal the physical decline of Babylon. They founded a brand new, massive capital city named Seleucia on the Tigris, located just a few dozen miles to the north. The central administration, the wealthy international merchant guilds, and large segments of the urban population were systematically relocated from Babylon to Seleucia, depriving the ancient metropolis of its vital economic revenues, political prestige, and demographic vibrancy. Although the grand temples of Marduk and Nabu remained partially active under the subsequent rule of the Parthian Empire, producing cuneiform documents well into the classical era. The physical infrastructure of the city steadily deteriorated. The great irrigation canals gradually filled with silt, the massive fortification walls slowly crumbled into dust, and the once glorious crossroads of global history quietly surrendered its living urban pulse, fading into a desolate landscape of fabled mounds and shifting sands, waiting for the dawn of the modern world to rediscover its buried secrets. The physical decline of Babylon under the Seleucid and Parthian empires marked the end of its reality as a living, breathing metropolis, yet it simultaneously initiated the most profound phase of its historical journey, its transformation from a physical capital of stone and mud brick into one of the most powerful, enduring, and complex cultural symbols in human history. As the shifting channels of the Euphrates River gradually moved away from its ancient canals, and the desert sands slowly covered its pulverized palaces, the name of Babylon was liberated from the constraints of geography, transforming into a timeless canvas upon which multiple civilizations would project their deepest fears, grandest ambitions, and most profound theological reflections. For centuries, following its physical abandonment, Babylon lived a vibrant, highly influential afterlife within the sacred texts of the world's major monotheistic religions. In the historical memory of the Jewish people, the city maintained a complex, deeply dualistic identity. On one hand, it was remembered with profound sorrow as the cruel place of captivity where the Judeans were forcefully taken after the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar's legions. This critical period of exile fundamentally reshaped Jewish theological thought, acting as the historical crucible that catalyzed the systematic codification of the Hebrew Bible and the crystallization of a resilient, globally adaptable identity independent of physical territory. On the other hand, within the poetic and apocalyptic literature of the prophets, Babylon was elevated into a monumental allegory for human arrogance, imperial hubris, and subsequent divine judgment. The biblical book of Isaiah foretold the city's absolute physical desolation in sweeping, haunting verses, while the book of Daniel presented the Neo-Babylonian court as a spectacular theatre of spiritual trial, where the faithful consistently resisted the idolatrous decrees of a foreign king. This moral transformation reached a dramatic climax in the Christian book of Revelation, written centuries later, where Babylon the Great reappeared entirely as a metaphor for a corrupt, tyrannical world order destined for ultimate cosmic destruction. Through these widely circulated texts, Babylon ceased to be a real historical city and transformed into a permanent warning, an absolute symbol of the inevitable fall of earthly pride. The Islamic tradition also meticulously preserved the memory of Babylon, though it refashioned its legacy through a different cultural prism. Early Islamic scholars, working within the magnificent translation movements of the Abbasid Golden Age, actively preserved, translated, and built upon many ancient Babylonian astronomical and mathematical texts, ensuring their structural survival and long-term influence across global scientific history. Concurrently, the Quran explicitly referenced Babylon as a historic location where two angels, Harut and Marut, taught mankind the secrets of sorcery and hidden knowledge as a test of moral willpower. This specific reference cemented Babylon's reputation within Islamic literature as an ancient, mysterious center of profound learning, hidden arts, and spiritual risk, adding another fascinating layer to its global mythological identity. While Babylon's symbolic power grew stronger across the centuries, its actual physical location was eventually forgotten by the Western world. Although classical Greek historians like Herodotus and Ctesias had written extensively of its colossal dimensions, their descriptions increasingly mingled with myth, causing medieval and Renaissance artists to imagine the ancient capital in fantastical, allegorical terms, most famously depicting the biblical Tower of Babel as a colossal, spiraling European stone tower defying the heavens. The real, historical city remained quietly buried beneath the silent, weathered mounds of Mesopotamia, known to the local Arabic-speaking populations simply as Babil, until the modern era of scientific exploration finally dawned. The spectacular physical resurrection of Babylon began in the 19th century, as European explorers and scholars, inspired by both biblical references and classical texts, systematically arrived in Mesopotamia to search for the physical remains of antiquity. The defining scientific breakthrough materialized in the early decades of the 20th century, when the brilliant German archaeologist Robert Koldewey led a highly systematic, meticulous excavation of the site over a span of nearly 2 uninterrupted decades. Koldewey's extraordinary engineering approach and patient grid excavations successfully uncovered monumental architecture that perfectly matched ancient descriptions, revealing the structural reality of the grand processional way, the foundations of the legendary palaces, the outlines of massive defensive fortification walls, and the physical base of the Etemenanke ziggurat, which had inspired the global legend of the Tower of Babel. Koldewey's most breathtaking discovery was the physical retrieval of the Ishtar Gate. The thousands of fragmented, colorful glazed bricks were carefully transported to Europe, where they were painstakingly cleaned, reassembled, and built into a full-scale reconstruction within the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. While this practice of mass archaeological extraction remains a subject of intense ethical and political debate today regarding cultural heritage ownership, it undeniably brought renewed, global attention to the artistic sophistication of the Neo-Babylonian world. In the subsequent decades, the site of Babylon became a focal point of intense nationalistic restoration under the modern Iraqi state, which undertook controversial building projects directly atop the ruins to link modern political authority with the ancient heritage of the land. In the 21st century, global institutions have worked tirelessly to protect and repair this invaluable archaeological landscape from the scars of modern conflict, culminating in Babylon's official designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Today, the ancient city stands as a magnificent paradox. It is both a quiet heap of weathered mud brick ruins in the Iraqi desert and a timeless, living symbol that continues to pulse through the languages, literature, and imagination of modern global society. The very terms we use daily remain deeply tied to its memory. To speak of Babylonian confusion is to reference a world of intense complexity, misunderstanding, and fragmented communication, beautifully reflecting the enduring human fascinations that the city has sparked across millennia. Ultimately, the entire story of the Babylonians is not merely a dry chronicle of shifting royal lineages, high-intensity land invasions, or monumental public works. It is an extraordinary testament to the relationship between fragile political power and resilient cultural memory. Empires rise and fall, great fortifications crumble into dust, and charismatic conquerors are inevitably humbled by the passage of time. But the enduring ideas that a truly great civilization leaves behind its systems of law, its mappings of the stars, its literary epics, and its unyielding search for cosmic order can outlive the destruction of its thrones, echoing across global history to challenge how we understand our own world. The questions that the people of Babylon asked across their thousands of years of survival remain fundamentally ours tonight. How shall we live together? What is universal justice? Who holds legitimate power, and why? In seeking those answers across the quiet hours of the evening, we are, in some profound sense, still walking the timeless streets of Babylon.